The second visit was to a man named Selim, a logistics officer whose job was managing the supply chains that kept the Karasi military fed and equipped, and whose position gave him a comprehensive view of the territory's military posture that few others possessed. Selim was different from Aslan, younger, sharper, more analytical, the kind of man who saw the world not in terms of loyalty and honor but in terms of systems and efficiencies, and whose disillusionment with Damir Khan was rooted not in moral objection but in the professional assessment that the alliance with Byzantium was strategically unsound, that it committed the Karasi to a conflict they could not win, that it exposed their supply lines to interdiction, that it divided their forces between two fronts without the resources to sustain operations on either, and that the eventual outcome, regardless of whether the Ottomans were defeated, would be the absorption of the Karasi into the Byzantine sphere of influence, a result that served the Shahanshah's interest but not the Karasi's. Koroğlu approached Selim differently than he had approached Arslan, because the arguments that work on a man of feeling do not always work on a man of calculation, and vice versa. He presented the case for defection not in terms of principle or honor, but in terms of interest, strategic interest, economic interest, the cold, hard mathematics of survival that Selim's mind was trained to process and evaluate. He laid out the numbers, the relative strength of the Ottoman and Byzantine forces, the vulnerability of the Karasi position, the likelihood of various outcomes, and he let the numbers speak for themselves, because numbers do not lie and they do not flatter, and Selim was a man who trusted numbers the way Arslan trusted his gut. Selim listened with the focused attention of a man hearing a proposal that confirms his own analysis, and when Koroğlu had finished, Selim did something that Arslan had not done. He asked about Dasun, specifically about the young man's capabilities, his character, his potential as a leader. And the questions were not idle curiosity but the evaluation of an investment, because Selim understood that defection was meaningless without a viable alternative. And a viable alternative required a leader who was capable of commanding loyalty and making decisions under pressure, and Dasun was the candidate being offered for this role, and Selim needed to be satisfied that the candidate was worthy before he would commit his resources and his reputation. Koroğlu spoke honestly about Dasun, acknowledging his youth and his relative inexperience while emphasizing his intelligence, his courage, his willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for principle, and the quality that Koroğlu believed was Dasun's greatest asset, the ability to inspire loyalty in men who had no obligation to follow him. He told Selim about the raid on the training camp, about the way Dasun had handled the confrontation with the soldiers, about the decision to lower the bow rather than kill the fleeing man, and Selim listened to this account with a slight smile that revealed more than any words could have, the smile of a man who has found what he was looking for and is satisfied with the discovery. The visit to Selim ended with a more concrete outcome than the visit to Arslan. Selim agreed not just to think about defection but to begin preparing for it, quietly redirecting certain supply flows within the system he controlled, creating small, strategic reserves at locations that would be useful to Dasun's forces if and when the break came, and building a communication network among sympathetic logistics personnel that could be activated on short notice. These preparations were invisible to anyone not looking for them, hidden within the normal fluctuations of a complex supply system, and their discovery by Damir Khan's loyalists was unlikely as long as Selim maintained the routine patterns of his official duties, which he was more than capable of doing, because Selim was a man who understood systems, and a man who understands systems can manipulate them without disrupting them, the way a surgeon can operate on a body without killing it. The third visit was the most dangerous and the most important, and Koroğlu made it last because it required the most preparation and the most nerve. The man he went to see was called Bayezid, and Bayezid was not a junior officer or logistics specialist but a senior commander. One of the three men who reported directly to Damir Khan and who commanded a division of 600 soldiers, the largest single formation in the Karasi military outside of Damir Khan's personal guard. Bayezid was a man of enormous physical presence and limited patience, a warrior whose reputation had been built on the battlefield rather than in the council chamber, and whose loyalty to the Karasi chieftaincy was so deeply ingrained that it was practically a physiological characteristic. as much a part of him as the color of his eyes or the breadth of his shoulders. But Koroğlu knew something about Bayezid that few others knew, something that he had observed during a conversation many months ago, a conversation that had taken place around a campfire after a day of exercises, when the wine had flowed freely and tongues had loosened, and the guards that men normally maintain around their private thoughts had been lowered just enough to allow a glimpse of what lay beneath. Bayezid had spoken briefly and with obvious discomfort about his son, a young man of 16 who had been assigned to Damir Khan's personal guard as a mark of honor, and who had, in the months since his assignment, been transformed from a cheerful, eager boy into a sullen, withdrawn youth who flinched at sudden movements and refused to speak about what happened in the guards' barracks. Bayezid had not elaborated, and Koroğlu had not pressed, but the implication was clear, and the fury in Bayezid's eyes, a fury that was directed not outward but inward, the fury of a father who suspects that his child is being mistreated but who feels powerless to intervene because the mistreatment is being sanctioned by the authority he has sworn to serve, was something that Koroğlu had never forgotten. He approached Bayezid's camp with the formal protocol that a visit between officers of their respective ranks required, sending a rider ahead to request an audience and waiting at the perimeter until permission was granted. The wait was longer than expected, and when the permission came, it was accompanied by an escort of 4 soldiers whose expressions were not welcoming, and Koroğlu rode through the camp with the uncomfortable awareness that every eye was on him and that many of those eyes were hostile because word of Dasun's rebellion had spread through the Karasi territory like a virus, infecting every conversation and every relationship with the suspicion that anyone might be a sympathizer, that anyone might be the next to break faith, and atmosphere in every Karasi camp and outpost had become charged with a paranoia that was destructive but understandable. Bayezid received him in his command tent, a large, sparsely furnished space that reflected its occupant's personality, practical, unadorned, focused on function rather than comfort. The commander was seated behind a rough wooden table, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his face set in an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile but watchful, the expression of a man who has been warned that the visitor sitting across from him may be an enemy but who has not yet made up his mind. Koroğlu knew that the approach he had used with Arslan and Selim would not work here. Bayezid was not a man who responded to emotional appeals or strategic analysis. He was a man who responded to strength, to directness, to the kind of forthright, unvarnished honesty that he practiced himself and that he demanded from everyone who sought his attention. So Koroğlu dispensed with the preliminary pleasantries and the careful indirect approach that he had used with the others, and he looked Bayezid in the eye and said simply that he knew about Bayezid's son, that he knew what was happening in Damir Khan's guard, and that the man who was supposed to protect the young warriors of the Karasi was instead allowing them to be brutalized, and that this, more than any political calculation or strategic assessment, was the reason that Koroğlu was sitting in this tent today. The effect of these words on Bayezid was immediate and devastating. The color drained from his face and then flooded back in a rush that turned his skin dark red, and his hands, which had been resting on his crossed arms, dropped to the table and gripped its edge with a force that made the wood creak, and the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables under tension, and his jaw clenched so tightly that Koroğlu could hear his teeth grinding. And for a long, terrible moment, Koroğlu thought that Bayezid was going to kill him, that the words had breached a wall behind which something enormous and destructive had been confined, and that the release of this force would be directed at the man who had triggered it rather than at the man who had caused it. But Bayezid did not kill him. Instead, after a silence that lasted for what felt like an hour but was probably no more than 30 seconds, the commander's grip on the table loosened, and his shoulders dropped and his chin fell to his chest, and the transformation was so complete and so sudden that it was like watching a fortress collapse. The walls that had been holding back the weight of emotion for months crumbling in an instant, and the man who remained was not the fearsome warrior that the Karasi army knew and respected, but a father, a broken, furious, heartbroken father who had been carrying a burden that no parent should have to carry and who had just been offered for the first time the possibility.
The dawn did not arrive gently over Bursa that morning. It came like a blade drawn slowly across the horizon, a thin line of crimson that widened and deepened until the entire eastern sky was stained with the color of blood, and the soldiers standing watch on the walls looked at that sky and said nothing, because soldiers are superstitious men who read omens in the flight of birds and the color of sunrises, and a sky the color of blood on the morning after a wedding was the kind of omen that no one wanted to be the first to name aloud. Tarhan had not slept. He had spent the hours between the end of the celebration and the first hint of dawn moving between the guard posts along the city walls, checking the alertness of the sentries, reviewing the sight lines from each tower, ensuring that the signal fires were properly laid and that the men responsible for lighting them understood that hesitation, even a moment's hesitation, could mean the difference between a city that was warned and a city that was surprised. He had sent 3 pairs of scouts into the darkness, each pair taking a different route toward Chanali, with orders to confirm the fortress's fall and to assess the size and composition of the occupying force. 2 of the pairs had not yet returned. The third had come back before midnight with a report that was worse than Tarhan had anticipated, not because the fortress had fallen, which he had already accepted as fact, but because the force that held it was larger than expected, significantly larger, which meant that Damir Khan had been planning this move for weeks, perhaps months, building his strength in secret while the attention of the Ottoman court had been focused on the Şahinşah'a and the diplomatic maneuvering that had preceded the negotiation. This was the information that Tarhan carried with him as he descended from the walls and made his way through the pre-dawn streets toward the palace, and the weight of it pressed against his chest like a stone lodged behind his ribs, making each breath a conscious effort. He passed through the market square, where the remnants of the previous day's celebration still littered the cobblestones, discarded flower petals and scraps of silk ribbon in the cold ashes of celebratory fires, and the contrast between the evidence of joy and the reality of threat was so stark that it felt almost personal, as though the universe were making a deliberate point about the futility of happiness in a world that was fundamentally hostile to it. He found Arhan Sahib already awake, already dressed, already standing at the window of his chamber looking out at the city with the fixed, unblinking gaze of a man who is seeing not what is before him but what is coming. The Sultan did not turn when Tarhan entered. He simply said in a voice that was quiet but carried the absolute authority of a man who has made his decision and is now merely communicating it, that he wanted the war council assembled within the hour. Not the full court, not the ceremonial gathering of advisors and scholars and administrators who would slow every decision with debate and qualification, but the inner circle, the men who fought, the men who bled, the men whose opinions were forged in the same fire that had forged the empire itself. Tarhan acknowledged the order and withdrew, and within minutes the machinery of summons was in motion. Messengers dispatched to the quarters of each member of the inner circle with the terse instruction that the Sultan required their presence immediately and that the matter was one of war. They gathered in the war room, a chamber deep within the palace that had been designed for exactly this purpose, a room with no windows and thick walls and a single door that could be barred from the inside, a room where secrets could be spoken without fear of eavesdroppers and strategies could be drawn on maps without fear of observation. The table at the center was large enough to seat 12 men comfortably and was currently covered with the same map that Arhan had studied the night before, its surface marked with small carved figures representing troop positions, each figure placed with a precision that reflected hours of intelligence gathering and analysis. The figures on the eastern side of the map, the ones representing Damir Khan's forces, had been updated since the previous day, their number increased and their position shifted to reflect the fall of Chanali, and the sight of them clustered around the tiny carved fortress sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the temperature. Tarhan took his position at the Sultan's right hand, and beside him stood Jurkutai, who had arrived with the rumpled appearance and sharp eyes of a man who had been woken from a deep sleep, and had transitioned to full alertness in the time it took to splash water on his face and buckle his sword belt. Tamer Boga stood opposite, his massive frame filling the space between the edge of the table and the wall behind him, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of grim anticipation, the look of a man who had been expecting bad news and was almost relieved that it had finally arrived, because the anticipation of disaster is often worse than the disaster itself. Darsan had been summoned as well, and his presence in the War Council was both a statement of trust and a tactical necessity, because no one understood the Karasi military structure better than the man who had been raised within it and had then turned against it. Sinos and Shamil stood near the door, their youth and relative inexperience marking them as observers rather than primary advisors, but their inclusion in the council was deliberate, another expression of Arhan's philosophy that the men who would fight the battles should have a voice in the planning of them. Evranash was there too, summoned from his wedding bed, and if there was any resentment in his expression at being torn from his new wife on the first morning of his married life, he concealed it completely behind the professional composure of a soldier who understood that duty did not pause for personal happiness, that the same strength that made a man worthy of love also made him indispensable in times of crisis. Orhan began without preamble, because the time for pleasantries had passed with the sunrise, and the blood-colored dawn that was even now brightening into the harsh white light of a winter morning demanded urgency rather than ceremony. He told them what Tarhan's scouts had confirmed, that Chanali had fallen, that the fortress was now held by a force of considerable size, that the eastern supply routes were compromised, and that Damir Khan had demonstrated a level of strategic planning and military capability that had been previously underestimated by everyone in this room, himself included. He said this last part without embarrassment, because Orhan understood that admitting a mistake was the first step toward correcting it, and a leader who could not acknowledge his own errors was a leader who was doomed to repeat them. He then laid out the situation with the cold clarity of a surgeon describing the extent of a wound before cutting. The Ottoman position was threatened on three fronts. To the east, Damir Khan held Chanali and the supply routes. To the west and south, the Şahinşah's forces were gathering strength, supplemented by the promise of European reinforcements that might or might not materialize but could not be ignored. And within the Karasi territory itself, the fracture that Darsan's rebellion had created was a wound that would bleed from both sides, weakening the Karasi as a whole while simultaneously creating a zone of instability that any opportunistic power could exploit. The question, Orhan said, was not whether to fight but how, and where, and in what order. An enemy that attacks you from three directions wants you to spread your forces thin enough to be defeated in detail. The counter to this strategy was concentration, the selection of a single point of maximum leverage and the application of overwhelming force at that point, accepting the risk of temporary vulnerability elsewhere in exchange for the decisive advantage of local superiority. Jurkutai spoke first, and his voice carried the pragmatic edge of a man who preferred problems to be solved with direct action rather than prolonged analysis. He said that Chanali was the key, that the fortress controlled the eastern road, and that as long as it was in enemy hands, Bursa was slowly strangling, its supplies dwindling, its options narrowing with each passing day. He argued for an immediate strike, a forced march east with the bulk of the available forces, a siege or an assault depending on the condition of the fortress's defenses, and a swift recapture that would restore the supply lines and demonstrate to both Damir Khan and the Şahinşah that Ottoman reach was longer, and Ottoman resolve was harder than they had calculated. Tarhan disagreed, and the disagreement was respectful but firm, the kind of professional difference of opinion that was not only tolerated in Orhan's war council but actively encouraged, because a leader surrounded by men who only agree with him is a leader surrounded by mirrors, and mirrors show you your own face but never the face of the enemy. Tarhan argued that a march east would leave Bursa dangerously exposed to the Byzantine forces gathering in the west, that the Şahinşah was almost certainly counting on exactly this reaction, and that the fall of Chanali might be not a strategic objective in itself but a lure, a piece of bait designed to draw the Ottoman army away from its fortified position and into open ground where it could be intercepted and destroyed. Tamer Boga growled his own assessment, and his words were few and forceful, as befitted a man who had built his reputation on action rather than eloquence. He said that the Şahinşah was a fox, not a lion, and that foxes relied on trickery and misdirection rather than direct confrontation. He said that the real danger was not the army gathering in the west or the garrison at Chanali, but the alliance between the two, the coordination between Damir Khan and the Şahinşah that allowed them to threaten from multiple directions simultaneously. Break the alliance, he said, and you break the threat. And the weakest point of any alliance is the trust between its members. Darsan, who had been listening with the focused intensity of a man whose personal stake in the outcome was as great as anyone's, spoke next, and his words carried a weight that went beyond military analysis because they were informed by an intimate knowledge of the enemy that no amount of scouting could replicate. He said that his father, the elder Karasi chieftain, was not a willing participant in Damir Khan's alliance with the Şahinşah but a reluctant one, dragged into the arrangement by his eldest son's ambition and his own inability to control it. He said that within the Karasi forces, there were factions and divisions that mirrored the ones that had driven him to rebel, officers and soldiers who were uneasy about the alliance with Byzantium, and who might, under the right circumstances, be persuaded to switch their allegiance. He proposed not a military assault on Chanali, but a diplomatic offensive aimed at fracturing the Karasi coalition from within, using his own connections and his knowledge of the internal politics of the Karasi court to identify and cultivate potential defectors. Evranash, speaking for the first time, offered a synthesis that drew from all the previous arguments and added a dimension that none of them had explicitly addressed. He said that the discussion was treating the military and the diplomatic as separate domains, when in fact they were inseparable. A show of military strength would lend credibility to the diplomatic approach, and a diplomatic success would reduce the military challenge. He proposed a combined strategy, a demonstration of force in the direction of Chanali that would make Damir Khan's garrison nervous and attentive, combined with a covert mission led by Darsan to contact sympathetic elements within the Karasi structure and begin the process of undermining the alliance from within. Simultaneously, the defenses of Bursa itself should be strengthened and the western approaches fortified, not to prepare for a siege, but to make the cost of a Byzantine advance prohibitively high, buying time for the eastern situation to be resolved before the western threat materialized. Orhan listened to all of this, and his expression gave nothing away, and when the last voice had fallen silent, he sat for a long moment in the kind of absolute stillness that precedes a decision of magnitude, the stillness of a man who is weighing not just the tactical options before him, but the lives that will be spent or spared by each choice, the consequences that will ripple outward through time like waves from a stone dropped into still water. And then he spoke, and his voice was the voice that had ordered charges and commanded retreats, that had offered mercy and pronounced judgment, the voice that every man in that room had learned to trust with his life. He accepted Evrenash's synthesis as the framework for action, but he modified it in ways that reflected his own understanding of the situation and his own instinct for the unexpected. The demonstration of force toward Chanali would proceed, but it would be led not by the main army but by a smaller, faster force under Jurkutai's command, a force designed to move quickly and strike hard, creating the impression of a larger army on the march while actually committing only a fraction of the available strength. The main army would remain in Bursa, but not passively. Tarhin would begin immediately strengthening the western defenses, not with walls and trenches alone, but with the kind of mobile defense that allowed a smaller force to contest a larger one by choosing the ground and controlling the tempo of engagement. Darsan's diplomatic mission would proceed as proposed, but it would be accompanied by a small military escort drawn from the men who had already proven their loyalty in the raid on the training camp, men who could be trusted to fight if the diplomacy failed and to restrain themselves if it succeeded. And there was one additional element that Orhan added to the plan, an element that surprised everyone in the room and demonstrated the depth of his strategic thinking. He said that Asporça would be sent with a message to certain elements within the Byzantine court, elements that he believed were sympathetic to the former Şahinşah and hostile to the current one, elements that might be willing to create internal problems for the young emperor at a moment when his attention and his forces were committed elsewhere. The former Şahinşah was dead, yes, but his death, especially if it could be credibly attributed to the current Şahinşah's ambition rather than to natural causes or suicide, was a grievance that could be weaponized among the Byzantine aristocracy, turning the Şahinşah's own court against him at the precise moment when he needed it unified. The room was silent for several heartbeats after Orhan finished speaking, and then Tarhin nodded slowly and deliberately, the nod of a man who has heard a plan that addresses every concern and creates opportunities that were not visible before. And one by one the others nodded as well, and the war council was concluded. And the men rose from the table and went to their respective tasks with the purposeful energy of soldiers who have been given clear orders and the freedom to execute them according to their own judgment. But before they dispersed, Orhan called Darsan back, and the two men stood alone in the war room, the carved figures on the map casting tiny shadows in the lamplight, and Orhan spoke to the young Karasi with a directness that was both an honor and a burden. He told Darsan that the mission he was about to undertake was the most dangerous of all the tasks that had been assigned, not because of the physical risks, which were considerable, but because of the emotional ones. Darsan would be going back to his own people, to men who considered him a traitor and who might kill him on sight, and he would be asking them to betray the allegiance they had chosen in favor of one that had not yet proven itself. He would be asking them to trust a man who had already demonstrated through his own rebellion that loyalty was conditional, that bonds of blood and custom could be broken if conscience demanded it. And this was a message that cut both ways, inspiring some and terrifying others, because if Darsan could break faith with his family, what guarantee was there that he would not break faith again with those he now sought to recruit? Darsan listened to all of this without flinching, and when Orhan had finished, the young man said simply that he understood the risks, that he had counted the cost before he ever set foot on this path, and that he was not asking anyone to do something he had not already done himself. He said that the men he intended to approach were not strangers but friends, men whose doubts he had seen in their eyes and heard in their whispered conversations during the long nights in the Karasi camp, men who had gone along with Damir Khan's alliance not out of conviction but out of inertia and fear, and he believed, with a certainty that came not from optimism but from knowledge, that they could be reached. Orhan placed his hand on Darsan's shoulder and held it there for a moment, and the gesture was worth more than any medal or title because it communicated something that words could not: the Sultan's personal faith in a man who had sacrificed everything and gained nothing except the right to stand on the side he believed was right. And then Orhan released him, and Darsan walked out of the war room and into the morning light, and the stone corridors of the palace echoed with his footsteps as he went to prepare for a journey that would either save the Karasi territory or cost him his life. While the War Council had been meeting, and the great decisions of strategy and alliance had been made, the daily life of the palace had continued with the relentless momentum of a river that flows regardless of the storms above it. In the women's quarters, Fatima had risen from her wedding bed and was being attended by the women of the household, who surrounded her with the particular kind of solicitous attention that is reserved for new brides, a mixture of genuine care and barely concealed curiosity about the details of the wedding night that manifested itself in meaningful glances and questions that were phrased innocuously but intended to elicit revelations. Fatima endured this attention with grace and humor, deflecting the more pointed inquiries with the skill of a diplomat and accepting the genuine warmth with the gratitude of a woman who understood that she was now part of a community of wives and mothers whose collective experience would be her greatest resource in the years to come. Malhun Khatun arrived to check on her daughter, and the interaction between them was different from the one they had shared the day before, because everything had changed in the space of 24 hours, and the mother-daughter relationship had been transformed by the intervention of marriage into something that was simultaneously closer and more distant. More intimate in the shared understanding of what it meant to be a wife, and more distant in the recognition that Fatima's primary loyalty now belonged to her husband and the household they would build together. Malhun looked at her daughter with eyes that saw not just the young woman before her but the infant she had held, the child she had taught, the girl she had guided and the wife she had become, and the layers of memory were so thick and so vivid that they seemed to shimmer in the air between them like heat rising from sun-baked stone. She told Fatima that the Sultan had called a war council, and she said it matter-of-factly without alarm or drama, because Malhun was a woman who had been married to power for long enough to understand that war councils were as much a part of domestic life as meal planning and child-rearing, and that the wife who could not accommodate the realities of her husband's profession was a wife who would be consumed by anxiety and resentment. Fatima received this information with a composure that made her mother proud, nodding once and then asking what she could do to help, not in the war council itself, where her presence would have been inappropriate, but in the broader effort of maintaining the household and the morale of the community during a time of increasing tension. Malhun told her that the best thing she could do was exactly what she was already doing, being present, being calm, being the center of a new household that would serve as an anchor for the men who would be going out to fight, and who would need something worth coming home to. Asporça had been summoned to a private audience with Orhan, and she walked through the palace corridors with the straight-backed carriage of a woman who had grown up in the most formal court in the world, and who carried that training with her the way a soldier carries a weapon, always available, always ready. She found the Sultan in a small garden adjacent to his private chambers, standing among the bare winter branches of a pomegranate tree that would not fruit for months, and the symbolism of this setting, a tree stripped of its beauty but still alive, still rooted, still waiting for the season that would restore it, was not lost on either of them. Orhan told her about the mission he had in mind, and he did not disguise it as a request or frame it as an option. He told her that her knowledge of the Byzantine court, her bloodline, her personal connections to the aristocratic families who had supported her grandfather, made her the only person who could carry this particular message with credibility. He told her that the message itself was simple but its implications were profound, that she would be telling people she had known since childhood that their emperor was a murderer, that the old Şahinşah had not died peacefully but had been driven to his death by the ambition of his own grandson, and that this crime, if left unanswered, would set a precedent that would eventually consume every family in the Byzantine nobility. Asporça listened, and her face was a study in the conflict between duty and desire, because the mission Orhan was describing would require her to return to the world she had left behind, to move through the shadows of a court that was hostile to everything she now represented, to confront the grief of her grandfather's death not in the privacy of her own chambers, but in the presence of people who would judge her mourning and measure her resolve and report every word she spoke to men who wished her dead. She was silent for a long time after Orhan finished, and the silence was filled with the rustle of bare branches in the winter wind and the distant sounds of the city going about its business. And then she spoke, and her voice was steady, and she said that she would go. She said it without hesitation and without qualification, and the simplicity of her acceptance was more powerful than any speech could have been, because it revealed the depth of a courage that was not the loud, performative courage of the battlefield but the quiet, sustained courage of a woman who has decided to face her fears and has no interest in being praised for the decision. Orhan thanked her, not with the formal gratitude of a sultan acknowledging a subject's obedience, but with the personal warmth of a man who recognized the magnitude of what was being offered, and he told her that she would not go alone, that a small escort would accompany her to the border, and that arrangements would be made within the Byzantine court itself, through channels that he did not specify and that she did not ask about, to ensure her safety during the most dangerous portions of her journey. Asporça left the garden and walked back through the palace corridors, and her mind was already working on the details of the mission, the people she would need to contact, the words she would need to use, the careful balance of grief and accusation that would be necessary to turn personal tragedy into political leverage. She passed by the women's quarters and heard the sound of Fatima's laughter drifting through the closed door, and the sound struck her with an unexpected force, because it was the sound of uncomplicated happiness, the sound of a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be, and Asporça felt a pang of something that was not envy but recognition, the recognition that she had never known that kind of happiness and might never know it. Because her life had been shaped by forces that did not care about her heart, and her destiny had been written in a language that did not include the word peace. She continued walking, and the sound of laughter faded behind her, and the corridor stretched out before her, long and dim, and leading to a door that opened onto a world she had thought she had left behind forever. In the hours that followed, the palace transformed from a site of celebration into a command center, the transition so seamless that an outside observer might not have noticed it happening at all. The silk banners that had decorated the courtyard for the wedding were quietly taken down and replaced with nothing, the bare walls and exposed stone serving as a more appropriate backdrop for the grim work that was now underway. The tables that had held platters of food and pitchers of sherbet were cleared and replaced with maps and dispatch boxes, and the leather-bound books in which the army's quartermaster recorded the inventory of weapons, provisions, and equipment. The musicians had packed their instruments and departed, and in their place, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed from the armory, where swords were being sharpened and arrowheads were being forged in anticipation of the conflict that every man in the palace now accepted as inevitable. Jurkutai assembled his strike force with the efficiency of a man who had done this so many times that every action was automatic, every decision instinctive. He selected 50 men, each one chosen not for rank or seniority, but for specific qualities that this particular mission required: speed, endurance, the ability to fight in small groups and make independent decisions, the willingness to endure hardship without complaint, and above all, the kind of aggressive, forward-leaning temperament that would turn a demonstration of force into a convincing threat without the numbers to back it up. These were the men who would ride east toward Chanali, moving fast and light, carrying only what they needed and nothing more, their mission not to besiege the fortress but to make Daimir Khan believe that a siege was imminent, to pin down the garrison and prevent it from reinforcing the Şahinşah's forces in the west, and to create enough uncertainty in Daimir Khan's mind that his strategic planning would be disrupted and his confidence shaken. Jurkutai briefed his men in the courtyard, standing on a mounting block so that his voice could carry to the back of the formation, and his words were characteristically direct. He told them they were going to make noise, lots of noise, the kind of noise that 1,000 men make when they move through a forest, the crash of undergrowth, the thunder of hooves, the shouts and horn calls that signal the approach of a major force. He told them they were going to light fires, many fires at intervals along the eastern road, fires that would be visible for miles and that would suggest an army in camp, an army preparing for an assault, an army that was patient and well supplied and in no hurry. He told them that they would not actually attack the fortress unless circumstances absolutely demanded it, and that their primary weapon was not the sword or the lance but the imagination of the enemy, because a man who believes he is about to be attacked fights a battle in his mind long before the first arrow flies, and a battle fought in the mind is exhausting in ways that a physical battle is not. The men listened and understood, and the smiles on some of their faces were the smiles of men who appreciated the elegance of the plan, the economy of achieving a strategic effect, with a fraction of the resources that a conventional approach would require. They mounted their horses and rode out through the eastern gate of Bursa in a column of twos, and the dust they raised hung in the cold morning air like a curtain drawn across the road behind them, and the sound of their hooves faded gradually into the distance, replaced by the sounds of the city resuming its daily rhythm. Tarhan, meanwhile, had turned his attention to the western defenses, and his approach was fundamentally different from Jurkutai's, because where Jurkutai's mission was about illusion and perception, Tarhan's was about substance and preparation. He walked the western perimeter of the city with a surveyor's eye, noting the places where the walls were weakest, where the ground outside offered natural cover for an approaching force, where the terrain channeled movement in ways that could be exploited by a defender. He identified 3 positions where the existing watchtowers needed to be reinforced, and 2 locations where new earthworks should be constructed to create interlocking fields of fire that would make a direct assault across the open ground west of the city prohibitively costly. He summoned the city's engineers and gave them instructions that were detailed enough to leave no room for improvisation, but flexible enough to accommodate the realities of the terrain and the available materials. Ditches would be dug in a pattern that forced any attacking force to approach the walls at an angle, exposing their unshielded side to archers on the ramparts. Stakes would be planted in the ditches at intervals designed to slow cavalry, without creating a uniform obstacle that could be bridged or breached in a single effort. and the approaches to the main gates would be narrowed with temporary barriers that could be removed quickly if the Ottoman forces needed to sally out, but that would funnel any attacker into a confined space where superior numbers became a disadvantage rather than an advantage. The engineers began their work immediately, and soon the western approach to Bursa was alive with the sounds of labor, the ring of picks on rocky soil, the thud of mallets driving stakes into the ground, the shouts of foremen directing work crews whose members had been drawn from the city's civilian population. Men who were farmers and merchants and craftsmen in normal times, but who understood that the defense of their city was everyone's responsibility, and that a ditch dug by a baker was just as deep as a ditch dug by a soldier. Darsan departed at midday, accompanied by Sinos and 4 other men who had proven their loyalty during the raid on the training camp. They rode north toward the Karasi territory, and the road they followed was the same road that Darsan had traveled countless times during his years as the young son of the Karasi chieftain, riding to hunting grounds and market towns and the seasonal camps where the Karasi people gathered to celebrate festivals and settle disputes. Every bend in the road was familiar, every landmark laden with memories that pressed against his consciousness like fingers pressing against a bruise, and Darsan rode through this landscape of memory with a face that revealed nothing and a heart that felt everything. Sinos rode beside him, and the young man's presence was a comfort that Darsan would not have admitted to anyone but that he felt deeply, because Sinos possessed a quality that was rare and invaluable in a world of calculated alliances and conditional loyalties, the quality of genuine, uncomplicated friendship. Sinos did not ride beside Darsan because he was ordered to or because he expected a reward. He rode beside him because he believed in him, and this belief, offered freely and without reservation, was the most powerful weapon Darsan carried, more powerful than the sword at his hip or the bow across his back. Because a man who knows he is believed in fights differently from a man who fights alone, and the difference is not one of technique but of spirit. They rode in silence for the first hour, the horses maintaining a steady pace that covered ground without exhausting the animals, and the landscape around them transitioned gradually from the cultivated fields and orchards that surrounded Bursa to the wilder, less managed terrain of the Karasi borderlands, where the trees grew thicker and the underbrush encroached upon the road, and the signs of human habitation became fewer and farther between. The air changed too, becoming colder and sharper as the road climbed into the hills that separated the two territories, and Darsan felt the change not just on his skin but in his bones, because this air was the air of his childhood, the air he had breathed during the years when the world was simple and his place in it was certain, and breathing it now as a man who had abandoned that certainty and struck out on his own was both exhilarating and painful in equal measure. They stopped at a crossroads where a small stream cut across the path, and the horses drank while Darsan dismounted and knelt beside the water and washed his face, and the water was so cold that it felt like a slap, a physical shock that brought his senses to full alertness and drove away the fog of fatigue and emotional turmoil that had been accumulating since the previous day. Sinos knelt beside him and drank from his cupped hands, and then he looked at Darsan and asked the question that he had been holding back since they left Bursa, the question that was on every man's mind, but that only someone with Sinos's guileless directness would have the courage to ask aloud. He asked what Darsan would do if his father refused to listen, if the men he sought to recruit proved loyal to Daimir Khan, if the entire mission collapsed into violence, and he found himself facing his own blood across drawn swords. Darsan did not answer immediately. He stared at the water flowing over the stones of the streambed, and the sound of it was like a voice speaking in a language he could almost but not quite understand, and he felt the weight of the question settle upon him with a gravity that was almost physical, pressing him down toward the earth, toward the water, toward the bedrock beneath both. And then he spoke, and his words were chosen with the careful precision of a man who has given this exact question more thought than anyone around him could possibly know. He said that he hoped it would not come to that his mission was persuasion, not conquest, and that the men he planned to approach were men of conscience who had been trapped by circumstances rather than converted by conviction. But he said that if it did come to violence, if the choice was between his family's honor and the principles he had sworn to uphold, he would choose the principles, because honor that requires you to do wrong is not honor at all but a disguise worn by cowardice, and he would rather be called a traitor by men who were wrong than be called loyal by men who had betrayed everything that loyalty was supposed to stand for. Sinos listened to this and nodded, not with the casual nod of social agreement but with the deliberate, firm nod of a man who has just heard something that he will remember for the rest of his life. And the two men rose from the streambed and mounted their horses and continued riding north, and the road grew steeper and the trees grew closer, and the sky above them narrowed to a strip of gray between the dark branches. And they rode into this narrowing world with their eyes open, and their weapons ready and their hearts carrying the terrible, liberating weight of a decision that had already been made and could not be taken back. Behind them, far to the south, the city of Bursa hummed with the controlled urgency of a hive that has sensed a threat but has not yet been attacked. The preparations for defense continued on every front, walls being strengthened, supplies being inventoried, weapons being distributed, patrol schedules being revised and intensified. And in the midst of all this activity, in the eye of the gathering storm, life continued with the stubborn persistence that is the defining characteristic of human civilization in times of crisis. Merchants opened their shops, children went to their lessons, women drew water from the wells and baked bread in the communal ovens. And Fatima Khatun, standing at the window of her new quarters in the wing of the palace that she now shared with Evernash, looked out at the city that was her home and felt, for the first time in her life, the full weight of what it meant to be bound to a man whose duty extended beyond the walls of their private happiness and into the vast, dangerous, unpredictable world beyond. She watched the soldiers moving through the streets below, their armor catching the weak winter sunlight, their faces set with the grim determination of men who were preparing for something they hoped would not come but expected would. And she thought of Evernash's face that morning when the summons had arrived, the way his expression had shifted from the soft, unguarded tenderness of a new husband to the hard, focused mask of a warrior in the space of a single heartbeat. And she understood in that moment something that her mother had tried to tell her, but that could only be truly learned through experience, that loving a soldier means loving the war as well, because you cannot separate the man from the duty, and the duty will always call, and the call will always be answered. And the woman who waits is fighting her own battle, a battle against fear and loneliness, and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether the man she loves will return from the darkness into which he has ridden. She pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window and left her palm print there, a mark that would fade as the glass warmed, but that for now was visible, proof that she had stood here, that she had looked out at this world, that she had felt what she felt and thought what she thought, and that she had not turned away. Evernash found her there when he returned from the war council, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her, and the tenderness that he had set aside for the business of war came flooding back, filling his chest with a warmth that was almost painful, and he crossed the room and stood beside her and took her hand, the hand that still bore the fading traces of henna, and he held it against his chest over his heart. And he told her that he had to ride out with a patrol to inspect the western fortifications, that he would be back before nightfall, and that she should not worry, and she smiled at this last instruction because they both knew it was impossible, and the impossibility of it was what made it worth saying. He kissed the top of her head and left, and she stood at the window and watched him cross the courtyard and mount his horse and ride out through the western gate, and she watched until he was nothing more than a dark speck against the pale winter landscape. And then she watched a little longer until even the speck was gone, and then she turned away from the window and began the process of building the life that would be waiting for him when he returned, a life of routine and purpose in the small daily acts of creation that are the foundation upon which everything else is built. The afternoon wore on and the shadows lengthened, and in the forests east of Bursa, Jurkutai's strike force began its work. They spread out along a front that was far wider than their numbers justified, each pair of riders responsible for a stretch of road or a section of forest, and they began the elaborate performance of deception that Jurkutai had choreographed with the attention to detail of a theater director staging a production. Fires were lit at regular intervals, large fires that consumed green wood and produced thick columns of smoke that rose above the tree canopy and were visible for miles, and the fires were placed in a pattern that suggested the campfires of a large force spread across a wide area, a force that was settling in for a prolonged stay rather than passing through on its way to somewhere else. Riders moved between the fires, maintaining them, adding fuel, adjusting their positions to create the impression of organized activity, and the hoofprints they left in the soft forest floor were deliberately multiplied, each rider leading a spare horse to double the apparent traffic on every trail and path. Horn calls echoed through the trees at intervals, the signals that an army uses to coordinate its movement and maintain contact between its units, and the calls were authentic because the men making them were authentic soldiers using authentic signals, and anyone listening from a distance would have heard exactly what Jurkutai wanted them to hear, the sounds of a professional military force preparing for action. The deception extended to the visual as well. Jurkutai had his men fell small trees and construct rough shelters along the roads, structures that from a distance looked like the hasty bivouacs of an army on the march, but that up close were nothing more than propped-up branches and draped cloth. He had flags planted at intervals, the banners of the Ottoman state snapping in the wind above empty clearings, creating the impression of command posts and assembly points where in reality there was nothing but fabric and poles and the cold winter air. And at the center of this elaborate fiction, Jurkutai himself rode back and forth along the line, coordinating the deception with the same energy and attention that he would have brought to an actual military operation, because in his mind there was no difference. Deception was warfare and warfare was deception, and the man who could make his enemy believe a lie was more powerful than the man who could field 10 times the soldiers, because soldiers can be counted but lies cannot, and a garrison that believes it is about to be attacked by 1,000 men will prepare for 1,000 men regardless of whether those men exist or not. And that preparation, that diversion of attention and resources and psychological energy, is a victory achieved without a single drop of blood. As darkness fell and the fires in the forest burned brighter against the deepening sky, the garrison at Chanali watched from the fortress walls and saw exactly what Jurkutai wanted them to see: a line of fires stretching across the eastern horizon, the unmistakable signature of an army in camp, and the commander of the garrison sent urgent messages to Daimir Khan reporting the approach of a significant Ottoman force and requesting reinforcements. And Daimir Khan, receiving these messages in his own camp further north, was forced to make a decision that he had not anticipated making so soon. A decision about whether to reinforce Chanali and risk weakening his position elsewhere, or to hold his current dispositions and risk losing the fortress he had just taken. This was exactly the kind of dilemma that Orhan had intended to create, the kind of impossible choice that forces an enemy to react rather than act, to spend his time and energy responding to threats rather than creating them. And the beauty of it was that it cost the Ottomans almost nothing, 50 men and some firewood, while costing Daimir Khan the initiative, the confidence, and the clarity of purpose that are essential to any military campaign. Far to the north, Darsan and his companions had left the main road and were moving through the hill country on paths that were not marked on any map, paths that existed only in the memory of men who had grown up in this land, and had explored its hidden valleys and secret passes as children playing the games that all children play, games of hiding and seeking and pursuing and escaping that were, in retrospect, nothing more than rehearsals for the adult world of war and espionage and the endless, exhausting struggle for survival. Darsan led the way, his horse picking its path between boulders and across streambeds with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that had been bred in these hills and knew their contours the way a sailor knows the currents of a familiar sea. They were heading for a village that Darsan knew well, a small settlement in a valley between two ridges that was home to a man named Koroglu, a mid-ranking officer in the Karasi military structure who had served under Darsan's father for 20 years and who had, in the months before Darsan's defection, expressed increasingly open doubts about Daimir Khan's alliance with the Byzantines. Koroglu was not a revolutionary. He was not a firebrand or a dissenter by temperament. He was a loyal soldier who had been raised to follow orders and who was profoundly uncomfortable with the orders he was now being asked to follow, and it was this discomfort, this deep-seated unease with the direction his commander had taken, that Darsan intended to exploit, not through manipulation or deception, but through the simple, powerful act of offering an alternative. They reached the valley as night was falling, and the village below them was a scattering of lights against the dark hillside, warm yellow points that indicated hearth fires and lanterns, and the comfortable domestic routines of a community that existed at a distance from the great events shaping the world around it. Darsan dismounted and stood on the ridge and looked down at these lights, and for a moment he was a boy again, riding into the same valley on his father's horse, the wind in his face and the world spread out before him like a gift, and the memory was so vivid and so painful that it took his breath away. Sinos came to stand beside him, and the young man said nothing because there was nothing to say, and the silence between them was the silence of companionship, the most valuable silence there is, and they stood together on the ridge and looked down at the village and prepared themselves for what was to come, because the next few hours would determine whether the Karasi territory could be united under a banner of principle or whether it would remain divided. A wound in the side of the Ottoman cause that would bleed and bleed until there was nothing left. Darsan took a breath and then another, and then he mounted his horse and began the descent into the valley. And the darkness closed around him like water around a diver, and the lights of the village grew larger and brighter as he approached, and the sound of dogs barking announced his arrival to every household in the settlement, and he rode on steady and deliberate toward the house of Koroglu, toward the conversation that would change everything or change nothing, and the night wrapped around him, cold and indifferent and vast, and the stars overhead watched without comment, as they always do, as they always have, as they always will, while below them, the small, fierce, magnificent drama of human courage and human frailty plays itself out in the brief, bright space between one darkness and the next. And the story continued because the story always continues, because the story of Orhan Sahib and the men and women who stood with him is not a story with an ending but a story with a direction, a trajectory, a momentum that carries it forward through darkness and through light, through war and through peace, through the terrible silences of grief and the glorious noise of celebration, forward, always forward, toward whatever awaits on the other side of the next dawn and the next after that. Because the arrow has left the bow and there is no calling it back and there is no stopping it, and the only question that remains is where it will land and what it will pierce and what it will change, and this question, like all the great questions, will not be answered by words but by the passage of time and the actions of men and women who have chosen to face the wind rather than hide from it, who have chosen to ride into the darkness rather than wait for the light, who have chosen to live as though their lives mattered. Because they do. The night that settled over Bursa was not the kind of night that forgives. It was thick and heavy and suffocating, the kind of darkness that presses against the skin like wet cloth, that fills the nostrils with the smell of iron and cold stone and the faint, acrid undertone of fear. Because fear has a smell, every soldier knows this, it rises from the pores of men who are standing still but whose hearts are running. and it accumulates in enclosed spaces, in guard towers and barracks, in the narrow corridors of palaces where torches burn low and shadows stretch long in every sound. Every creak of wood, every scrape of boot on stone, carries the electric charge of anticipation. Tarhan had not left the walls. He had been standing at the western rampart for hours, his cloak pulled tight against the cold, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the city as though he could see through it by sheer force of will, and in a way he could, because Tarhan did not need to see the Byzantine column to know it was there. He could feel it the way a sailor feels a storm before the first cloud appears on the horizon, a pressure in the air, a heaviness in the silence, the indefinable sense that the world had shifted on its axis and that the balance of forces that had kept things stable was now tilting, slowly but irrevocably, toward confrontation. The signal fires along the western chain had been burning steadily since the first reports of the Byzantine advance, and their light, distant and flickering, created a line of orange points along the dark horizon that looked like the eyes of an animal crouching in the darkness, watching, waiting, measuring the distance between itself and its prey. Tarhan counted the fires and noted that none had gone out, which meant the scouts at each position were still alive and still reporting, and the steady burning was itself a message, a continuous transmission that said the enemy is still moving, still approaching, still coming. He had stationed his best archers at the corners of the western wall, where the defensive towers provided elevated firing positions that commanded the open ground between the city and the first line of trees. These were not ordinary bowmen but specialists, men who had been trained to shoot at extreme range and who could put an arrow into a target the size of a man's chest at distances that most archers would consider impossible. Their role was not to stop an army but to punish it, to make the approach to the walls so costly that any commander with sense would think twice before ordering his men across that killing ground, and if the commander lacked sense, to educate him through the medium of feathered shafts and iron broadheads. Below the walls, the earthworks that Tarhan had ordered were nearing completion, and even in the darkness, the sounds of labor continued, the ring of picks and the thud of mallets muffled by the night air but still audible, a rhythm that had become the heartbeat of the city's preparations, constant and reassuring in its persistence. The ditches had been dug to a depth of 6 feet and lined with sharpened stakes at the bottom, angled to catch and hold anyone who fell into them, and the spoil from the digging had been piled on the city side of the ditches to create a raised berm that would provide additional cover for defenders and additional obstruction for attackers. The approaches to the gates had been narrowed as planned, temporary barriers of timber, and packed earth funneling any assault into channels where concentrated fire could decimate even the most determined charge. Tarhan inspected each position one final time, moving along the wall with the methodical thoroughness that was his signature, pausing at each guard post, exchanging a few words with the men stationed there, checking their equipment, their water supply, their state of alertness. He found one sentry whose eyes were glazed with the early stages of sleep, and he did not reprimand the man but instead placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke quietly, reminding him that his wife and children were sleeping in a house 3 streets behind this wall, that the distance between their safety and their destruction was measured in the width of the stone he was standing on and the sharpness of the eyes he was keeping open, and the sentry straightened and his eyes cleared and he would not sleep again that night. In the palace below, Orhan Sahib had convened a smaller, more focused meeting than the full war council of the previous day. This was not a gathering of generals and advisors, but a conversation between 3 men, Orhan Tarhan, who had descended briefly from the walls, and Evranash, who had returned from his inspection of the perimeter with additional intelligence that needed to be discussed before decisions could be made. They stood around the map table in the war room, the carved figures rearranged to reflect the latest information. The Byzantine column now represented by a cluster of pieces advancing from the west, the garrison at Chanali still holding in the east, and the scattered, uncertain disposition of the Karasi forces in the north, some aligned with Daimir Khan, some potentially sympathetic to Darsan, and most simply waiting, as people in zones of conflict always wait, for the situation to clarify itself enough to make the right choice obvious. Evranash reported what his patrol had observed during the day. The Byzantine column was moving at a deliberate pace, not the rapid march of an army racing to attack, but the measured advance of a force that wanted to be seen, that wanted its approach to register in the minds of the defenders as an inescapable fact, the way the tide registers in the mind of a man standing on a beach, not sudden but certain, not fast but unstoppable. He estimated the column's strength at between 3,000 and 4,000 men, a force significantly larger than the Ottoman garrison at Bursa but not overwhelmingly so, and he noted that the column included a significant cavalry component, which suggested that the Şahinşah was planning not a siege but an engagement in open ground, where cavalry could be used to its full effect. This was a crucial observation because it changed the nature of the threat from a static problem to a dynamic one. A siege was a contest of patience and provisions, a grinding war of attrition that favored the defender as long as the supplies held out. A battle in open ground was a contest of skill and numbers, a sharp, decisive engagement that could be won or lost in a matter of hours, and the outcome would depend on factors that were difficult to predict and impossible to control: the terrain, the weather, the morale of the troops, the decisions made in the heat of combat by individual commanders who might or might not be equal to the pressure. Orhan absorbed this analysis and turned it over in his mind, examining it from every angle, testing it against his own instincts, and what he found confirmed what he had suspected since the beginning, that the Şahinşah was not interested in a prolonged campaign. The young emperor wanted a quick, decisive victory that would establish his credentials as a military leader, that would silence the critics in his own court who questioned his legitimacy, and that would demonstrate to the Pope and the European powers that their investment in his cause was justified. A siege would take too long, cost too much, and produce the wrong kind of narrative, the narrative of a mighty empire struggling to recapture a single city from a band of upstart warriors. A battle, on the other hand, especially a victorious one, would produce the kind of story that empires are built on: the story of a young emperor riding at the head of his army, crushing the enemy in a single glorious engagement, restoring the honor of Byzantium and the territories of the empire in one swift, masterful stroke. The question was whether to give the Şahinşah the battle he wanted or to deny it to him, to stay behind the walls and force a siege that the Byzantine emperor did not want and could not afford, or to march out and meet the enemy on ground of Orhan's choosing, where Ottoman skill and Ottoman courage could be brought to bear in the close, violent, personal combat that was the Ottomans' greatest strength. Orhan argued for the walls. His reasoning was sound, as Orhan's reasoning always was, built on the solid foundation of practical assessment rather than emotional impulse. The walls of Bursa were strong, the defenses had been reinforced, the provisions were adequate for at least 3 weeks, and every day that the Şahinşah sat outside the walls was a day that his coalition frayed a little more, his supplies diminished a little further, and the risk of internal dissent within his own ranks grew a little greater. Time was the Ottomans' ally, Orhan argued, and the walls were the instrument through which time could be converted into advantage. Evranash argued for the field. His reasoning was equally sound but built on a different foundation, the foundation of psychological warfare and strategic initiative. Staying behind the walls ceded the initiative to the enemy, allowed the Şahinşah to choose the time and place of any engagement, and projected an image of weakness that would embolden not just the Byzantines but every other power watching the conflict: the Karasi, the Bulgarians, the European crusaders whose participation was still uncertain. Marching out to meet the enemy, on the other hand, would demonstrate confidence, seize the initiative, and force the Şahinşah to fight on terms that he had not chosen and might not be prepared for. Orhan listened to both arguments, and the silence that followed was the silence of a mind working at its highest capacity, processing variables and calculating probabilities and weighing risks against rewards, with the precision of a master craftsman measuring the tolerances of a mechanism that must function perfectly or not at all. And then he made his decision, and the decision was neither Orhan's nor Evranash's but something that drew from both and transcended both, a synthesis that revealed the depth of strategic vision that had carried him from the uncertain beginnings of his rule to the position he now occupied, the position of a man who was surrounded by enemies and yet refused to act like a man who was surrounded. He would do both. The main force would remain behind the walls, manned by Orhan and the garrison troops and the civilian volunteers who had been armed and trained during the days of preparation. The walls would be defended with the full intensity of Orhan's meticulous planning, the earthworks and the archers and the signal fires and the interlocking defensive positions that would make any assault prohibitively costly. But simultaneously, a mobile strike force, smaller but faster, more agile, more dangerous, would operate outside the walls, using the terrain around Bursa to harass the Byzantine column, attack its supply lines, raid its camps, disrupt its formations, and create the constant grinding pressure that turns a confident advance into a nervous crawl. This strike force would be led by Evranash, and it would be composed of the best horsemen and the most experienced fighters available, men who could operate independently, make decisions without waiting for orders, and fight with the kind of controlled aggression that turns small engagements into outsized victories. They would not seek a decisive battle, not yet, but they would make the Şahinşah pay for every mile he advanced, and the price, measured in casualties and delays and the erosion of morale that comes from being attacked without warning and without pattern, would accumulate until the Byzantine commander was forced to choose between pressing forward into an increasingly hostile environment or pulling back to regroup and reconsider. And while the walls held and the strike force harassed, the other elements of Orhan's strategy would continue to develop. Darsan's diplomatic mission in the north would continue to peel away supporters from Daimir Khan's coalition. Jurkutay's deception in the east would continue to pin down the garrison at Chanali. Bayram and Kemal would continue their quiet subversion inside the fortress. And Asporça would continue her journey toward the Byzantine court, carrying the truth about the former Şahinşah's death like a torch into a powder magazine. The plan was complex, perhaps dangerously so, with multiple moving parts that needed to function in coordination despite being separated by miles of hostile territory, and connected only by messengers and signal fires, and the shared understanding of a strategy that left significant room for individual judgment and initiative. But complexity was not the same as fragility, and Orhan understood that a simple plan against a numerically superior enemy was a plan that the enemy could predict and counter, while a complex plan, executed by capable and trusted commanders, created the kind of multidimensional pressure that no single response could address. He dismissed the meeting, and the three men went their separate ways, each carrying his portion of the plan, each aware of the magnitude of what was being asked of him. And the war room was left empty except for the map and the carved figures and the single candle that continued to burn, its flame straight and steady, unmoved by the currents of air that the departing men had created, a small, persistent light in a room full of shadows. Evranash assembled his strike force in the courtyard before dawn, selecting his men with the ruthless efficiency of a commander who understood that the quality of a unit was determined not by its size, but by the caliber of every individual within it. He chose 40 riders, men whose horsemanship was exceptional even by Ottoman standards, men who could ride at full gallop through forest and across rough ground without losing their seats, who could shoot accurately from the saddle at moving targets, who could switch from mounted combat to dismounted fighting and back again with the fluidity that comes from years of practice and the kind of bone-deep familiarity with horse and weapon that borders on the instinctive. Among them was Shamil, whose ferocity in combat had been proven at the training camp raid, and whose eagerness for action was so palpable that it radiated from him like heat from a fire. There was also a man called Orhan, not to be confused with the Sultan, a quiet, methodical fighter whose specialty was ambush, a man who could read terrain the way a scholar reads a book, identifying the passages and the dead ends and the places where meaning could be extracted through careful attention. And there was a woman, a detail that would have surprised anyone not familiar with the Ottoman practice of including exceptional individuals regardless of convention, a writer named Zeliha whose family had produced warriors for 3 generations, and whose ability to track an enemy through open country was matched only by her ability to put an arrow through his throat when she found him. They rode out through a postern gate on the northern side of the city, a small, inconspicuous opening in the wall that was designed for exactly this kind of covert departure, and they circled wide around the city, using the terrain to stay out of sight of any Byzantine scouts who might be watching the main gates, and they swung south and west, positioning themselves behind and to the flank of the advancing Byzantine column, where they could observe its movement and choose the moment and the place for their first strike. The column was exactly where Evranash had predicted it would be, moving along the main western road with the steady, ponderous pace of a force that was confident in its strength but cautious about the unknown. The vanguard consisted of cavalry, heavy lancers whose horses were armored, and whose riders carried the long, leaf-bladed spears that had been the signature weapon of Byzantine cavalry for centuries. Behind them came the infantry, rank after rank of soldiers marching in formation, their shields overlapping to create a continuous wall of painted wood and leather that rippled like the scales of a giant serpent as the column moved. And behind the infantry came the baggage train, the long tail of wagons and mules and camp followers that supplied the army with food and water and fodder, and the 1,000 other necessities that an army on the march consumes the way a fire consumes fuel. Evranash studied the column from the cover of a wooded ridge, and his eyes moved along its length with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent his life analyzing military formations for weaknesses. The vanguard was strong but stretched thin, the cavalry spread out along the road in a formation that prioritized speed of advance over mutual support. The infantry was disciplined but tired, the dust on their faces and the heaviness of their steps suggesting that they had been marching for longer than was comfortable. And the baggage train was vulnerable, strung out along the road with minimal escort, the wagons separated by gaps that were wide enough to exploit. He made his decision. The first strike would target the baggage train, not because it was the most glamorous target, but because it was the most strategically valuable. An army that loses its baggage loses its ability to sustain itself in the field, and an army that cannot sustain itself must either find new supplies, which takes time and diverts attention from combat, or retreat to a position where supplies are available, which means giving up the ground it has gained. A single successful raid on the baggage train could set the Byzantine advance back by days, and days were exactly what Orhan needed. He divided his force into 3 groups. The first group, led by Shamil, would create a distraction at the head of the column, riding close enough to the vanguard to draw the attention of the cavalry without actually engaging them, a feint designed to make the Byzantine commander look forward while the real attack came from behind. The second group, led by Orhan, would strike the baggage train itself, hitting the wagons hard and fast, destroying what could be destroyed and scattering what could not, and then withdrawing before the escort could organize a response. The third group, led by Evranash himself, would position itself between the baggage train and the infantry, blocking any attempt by the main body of the column to reinforce the rear and buying Orhan's group the time it needed to complete its work. The 3 groups separated and moved into position with the silent efficiency of men who had rehearsed this kind of operation many times, not in formal exercises, but in the countless small engagements and border skirmishes that had been the daily reality of Ottoman military life for as long as any of them could remember. They communicated through hand signals and the positioning of their horses, using a vocabulary of movement that was as precise and as expressive as any spoken language, and within minutes they were in place, each group concealed in the terrain on either side of the road, invisible to the passing column, waiting for the signal that would set the operation in motion. Shamil gave the signal, a single arrow shot high into the air that caught the sunlight at the apex of its arc and glittered for a moment like a tiny star before falling back to earth. The arrow was not aimed at anyone. It was a message, a starting gun, a spark dropped into a carefully prepared fire, and the effect was immediate. Shamil's group burst from the trees ahead of the column, 20 riders emerging from the undergrowth with a speed and suddenness that made them seem like they had materialized out of thin air, and they charged toward the vanguard with the wild, ululating war cry that was the signature of Ottoman cavalry, a sound that was designed to freeze the blood and scatter the thoughts and create in the mind of the enemy a momentary paralysis that could be exploited before training and discipline reasserted themselves. The Byzantine lancers reacted as trained soldiers react, wheeling their horses and forming a line to receive the charge, their lances lowering to present a wall of steel points that would impale any rider foolish enough to continue straight at them. But Shamil had no intention of continuing straight at them. At the last possible moment, with the lancers' horses so close that he could see the whites of their eyes and the foam on their bits, he pulled his horse sharply to the left and his riders followed, the entire group veering away from the lance line in a maneuver so sudden and so precise that it left the Byzantine cavalry stabbing at empty air, their momentum carrying them forward into the space that Shamil's riders had just vacated, and by the time they had stopped and reorganized. Shamil's group was already 50 yards away, circling back, reforming, preparing for another pass, taunting the lancers with the infuriating mobility that light cavalry has always used to torment heavy cavalry, the ability to be everywhere and nowhere, to threaten without engaging, to sting without exposing themselves to the crushing blow that the lancers were designed to deliver. The Byzantine commander at the head of the column took the bait. He ordered his cavalry to pursue to catch these impudent raiders and destroy them, and the lancers surged forward, their heavy horses building to a gallop that shook the ground and raised a cloud of dust that obscured the road behind them. Shamil's riders stayed just ahead, leading the pursuit northward, away from the road, away from the column, away from the baggage train that was now exposed and unprotected at the rear. Orhan struck at the moment the dust from the cavalry pursuit settled enough to reveal the baggage train, its wagons crawling along the road with the slow, vulnerable pace of animals that do not know they are being hunted. His group came out of the trees on both sides of the road simultaneously, 20 riders closing on the wagons like the jaws of a trap, and the escort, a handful of infantry who had been assigned to guard the supplies and who had been watching the cavalry charge to the north with the fascination of spectators at a sporting event, found themselves surrounded before they had time to draw their weapons. The raid was executed with brutal efficiency. Riders swept past the wagons at full gallop, leaning from their saddles to slash the ropes that held the cargo in place, sending sacks of grain and bundles of arrows and rolls of tent canvas tumbling to the ground where they were trampled by the following horses. Other riders threw torches into the wagons themselves, the dry wood of the wagon beds catching fire with a speed that was almost explosive, and within minutes 5 of the 12 wagons were burning, their contents consumed by flames that sent columns of black smoke rising into the sky like funeral pyres. The mules panicked, as mules always do when confronted with fire and noise, and their panic spread to the draft horses, and suddenly the baggage train was a chaos of terrified animals and burning wagons and shouting men, and the escort, those few infantry who had not been knocked down in the initial charge, were trying to control the animals and fight the attackers and extinguish the fires simultaneously. And none of these tasks could be accomplished because all of them required the kind of calm, organized effort that is impossible in the middle of an ambush. Evernosh's group, positioned between the baggage train and the infantry column, did not need to fight. Their presence alone was sufficient to achieve their objective, because the infantry commanders, hearing the commotion to their rear and seeing the smoke rising above the trees, wanted to send troops to rescue the supplies but found their route blocked by a line of mounted warriors whose formation was too tight to break through without a sustained effort that would take time they did not have. They hesitated, caught between the instinct to help and the training that told them not to break formation, and in that hesitation the precious minutes that Orhan needed to complete his work ticked away, each one a small victory, each one a grain of sand in the hourglass of the Byzantine advance. Orhan completed his work and withdrew, his riders melting back into the forest with the same sudden efficiency with which they had appeared, and Evernosh's blocking group followed, peeling away from the road in a coordinated withdrawal that left the infantry staring at empty ground where a moment ago there had been armed horsemen. Shamil's group, having led the Byzantine cavalry on a chase that had taken them more than a mile from the column, executed a final feint that sent the lancers galloping in the wrong direction, and then turned and rode hard for the rendezvous point, a clearing in the forest 3 miles south of the road where the three groups would reassemble and assess the results of the operation. They met at the clearing as the sun reached its zenith, and the mood was electric, the charged, vibrating energy that follows a successful action, the energy of men who have tested themselves against an enemy and found themselves equal to the challenge. Orhan reported 5 wagons destroyed, 3 more damaged, and an estimated 2 days' worth of provisions consumed by fire. Shamil reported no casualties in his group and at least 3 Byzantine lancers unhorsed during the pursuit, riders who had been thrown when their heavy horses stumbled on the uneven ground that Shamil had deliberately led them across. Evrenash's group reported no contact and no casualties, their mission accomplished through presence rather than violence. The total cost of the operation was 2 horses slightly lamed, and 1 rider with a cut on his forearm from a lance tip that had come closer than intended during Shamil's initial feint. The benefit was measured not just in the supplies destroyed but in the message sent, the message that the Ottoman army was not cowering behind its walls but was actively present in the field, capable of striking at any point along the line of advance, and willing to fight with a ferocity and a skill that would make every mile of the approach to Bursa mile paid for in blood and treasure. Evrenash allowed his men a brief rest, enough time to water the horses and eat a handful of dates and dried meat, and then he divided the force again and sent Shamil's group north to find a new position from which to observe and harass the column's flank, while Orhan's group was sent south to watch for any attempt by the Şahinşah to send a flanking force around the city's southern approaches. Evrenash himself, with the remainder of the force, would shadow the column from a distance, maintaining contact without engaging, a constant, invisible pressure that would force the Byzantine commander to keep his formations tight and his scouts active, diverting energy and attention from the advance itself. The afternoon wore on, and the Byzantine column, now missing a third of its baggage train and acutely aware that the enemy was somewhere in the surrounding forest, adjusted its formation with the cautious deliberation of a force that has been hurt and does not want to be hurt again. The cavalry was pulled back from its advanced position and redistributed along the length of the column, trading speed of advance for security of flanks. The infantry tightened its formation, the gaps between units closing until the column moved as a single solid mass that presented no obvious point of attack, and the remaining wagons were moved to the center of the column, surrounded by soldiers on all sides, protected but also slowed, because a column that is shaped by fear is a column that moves at the pace of its most cautious element. The Şahinşah received the report of the raid in his command tent, which had been set up at the head of the column during the midday halt, and his reaction was precisely what Evrenash had hoped for, a combination of fury and caution that produced the worst possible outcome for a military commander, the desire to act aggressively combined with the fear of acting rashly. He wanted to send his cavalry into the forest to hunt down the raiders, but his advisors warned him that the forests around Bursa were the Ottomans' home ground, that sending cavalry into terrain where they could not use their mass or their speed was a recipe for disaster, and that the raiders wanted to be chased, that pursuit was part of their strategy, and that the correct response was not to take the bait but to maintain discipline and continue the advance, accepting the harassment as the cost of operating in enemy territory. Mahmud, sitting beside the Şahinşah with the same silent, watchful presence that characterized every interaction between them, offered a different perspective. He said that the raid was not merely a tactical nuisance but a strategic signal, evidence that Orhan's forces were not committed to a purely defensive posture but were operating offensively, which meant that the Ottoman army was not as stretched thin as the fall of Çanakkale might have suggested, which in turn meant that the intelligence on which the Byzantine campaign plan was based might be incomplete or inaccurate, and that any further advance should be undertaken with extreme caution until the true disposition of the Ottoman forces could be determined. The Şahinşah listened to this counsel and hated it because it was the counsel of patience, and patience was not a virtue he possessed in abundance. He was young and he was proud, and he had been raised on stories of his ancestors' military glory, ancestors who had not skulked along roads while their baggage burned but had charged at the head of their armies and broken their enemies through the sheer weight of imperial will. But he was also intelligent enough to recognize that the stories of ancestral glory did not include the parts where those ancestors had suffered defeats that were erased from the official histories, and that the line between bold leadership and reckless folly was often visible only in retrospect. He gave the order to continue the advance but at a reduced pace, and he doubled the cavalry patrols on both flanks, and he sent riders back to his base camp with orders to dispatch additional supplies to replace those that had been destroyed. And these measures, all of them sensible, all of them necessary, had exactly the effect that Orhan had intended. They slowed the Byzantine advance from a steady march to a cautious crawl, buying time that the Ottoman defenders would use to strengthen their positions, to complete their preparations, and to bring the other elements of the larger strategy closer to fruition. As the afternoon light faded and the shadows of the trees lengthened across the road, the Byzantine column ground to a halt and began the process of making camp for the night. And the soldiers who dug the defensive ditches and erected the palisades and posted the sentries were tired and nervous and acutely aware that somewhere in the darkening forest, unseen eyes were watching them, and unseen hands were gripping unseen weapons. And the night that was coming would be long and cold, and filled with the sounds of a forest that might or might not conceal the men who had burned their wagons and scattered their mules, and demonstrated with humiliating clarity that the road to Bursa was not the triumphal procession that the Şahinşah had envisioned. In the north, Darsan had returned to Bursa with the results of his meeting with Koroglu, and the report he delivered to Orhan was cautiously optimistic, the report of a man who had found what he was looking for but who understood that finding something and holding it were two very different things. Koroglu was sympathetic and willing to act, but the network of potential defectors was fragile, held together by shared doubts rather than shared conviction. And any misstep, any premature move, any leak of information to Demir Khan's loyalists could collapse the entire structure and leave everyone involved exposed to retribution. Orhan listened and asked the questions that needed to be asked, probing questions that tested the solidity of Darsan's assessment without undermining the confidence that was necessary to continue the operation. He asked about specific individuals, about their reliability, their motivations, their vulnerabilities, and Darsan answered each question with the detailed knowledge that came from a lifetime spent within the Karasi social structure. Knowledge that no amount of intelligence gathering could replicate because it was not merely information but understanding. The deep intuitive understanding that comes from having grown up with these people, having eaten at their tables, having watched their children play. Having heard their prayers and their complaints, and their jokes around campfires on cold nights. When the debriefing was complete, Orhan told Darsan to rest, because the next phase of the diplomatic mission would require him to return to the Karasi territory, this time not to make contact but to coordinate action, and the risks of this second journey would be exponentially greater than the first, because Demir Khan would have been alerted by the escaped soldier from the training camp and would be watching for exactly the kind of outreach that Darsan was attempting. Darsan accepted the instruction to rest but did not rest. Instead, he went to the small mosque where he had prayed the previous morning, and he knelt on the cold stone floor. And the prayer that rose from his lips was not the formal, structured prayer of ritual observance, but the raw, unedited prayer of a man who is carrying a burden too heavy for his own strength, and who is asking with a humility that pride would never have permitted, for the strength to carry it a little farther, a little longer, just enough to reach the next milestone. The next decision point, the next moment when the path would become clear and the weight would either be lifted or would crush him. The mosque was empty except for him and the silence and the faint smell of incense that lingered from the morning's worship. And the silence was not empty but full of the accumulated prayers of all the men and women who had knelt on the same floor and asked for the same things, strength and guidance and the courage to face what could not be avoided. And Darsan drew from this accumulated devotion a sustenance that food and sleep could not provide. A nourishment of the spirit that is available only to those who are willing to admit their need for it. He rose from the floor and walked out into the evening air, and the city of Bursa was spread out before him, its rooftops catching the last light of the setting sun, its streets alive with the movement of people going about the business of living in a world that was simultaneously beautiful and terrible. And Darsan stood on the steps of the mosque and looked at the city and felt, for the first time since his defection, something that might have been peace, not the absence of conflict but the presence of purpose. The deep, quiet certainty that he was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to do, and that whatever came next, whatever price was demanded of him, he would pay it willingly, because the alternative of standing by and watching while everything he believed in was destroyed by men who believed in nothing but their own advancement, was a price that was infinitely higher and that he was not willing to pay. He walked back to his quarters and lay down on his bed and closed his eyes, and sleep came to him quickly, the deep, dreamless sleep of exhaustion and surrender, and the night settled around him like a blanket, and the sounds of the city faded into the background, and Darsan slept while the world outside his window continued its relentless turning, the fires burning on the walls, the sentries walking their posts, the stars moving across the sky in their ancient patterns. Indifferent to the affairs of men, but beautiful nonetheless, beautiful because of their indifference, beautiful because they would still be there long after the battles were won and lost, long after the walls had crumbled, long after the men who had fought and bled and prayed and loved beneath them had returned to the earth from which they came. And in the forest, in the darkness, Evranash sat motionless on his horse and watched the Byzantine camp through the trees. The fires of the camp burned in neat rows, the disciplined arrangement of a professional army at rest, and the sentries walked their beats with the mechanical regularity of men performing a duty that has been drilled into them so thoroughly that it requires no conscious thought. He counted the fires and estimated the strength of the camp and noted the positions of the cavalry pickets and the infantry outposts, and he filed each observation away for the report he would send to Tarhan at first light. And then he turned his horse and rode back to his own camp, a cold, fireless camp hidden in a ravine 2 miles from the road, where his men slept wrapped in their cloaks on the bare ground, their horses tethered in a line, their weapons within arm's reach, ready to mount and ride at a moment's notice. He dismounted and unsaddled his horse and rubbed the animal down with a handful of dry grass, because a commander who neglects his horse neglects the instrument of his survival, and Evrinosh had learned this lesson early and had never forgotten it. He thought of Fatima as he worked, thought of the bow she had strung and laid across the table, thought of the quiet determination on her face when she heard the gates close, thought of the woman she was becoming, not the gentle bride of the wedding day but the steel-cord companion of the days that followed, and the thought of her warmed him in a way that no fire could. And he finished his work and lay down beside his horse and pulled his cloak over himself and stared up at the sky through the bare branches of the trees above. And the stars looked back at him with their ancient, unblinking gaze, and the night was cold and the ground was hard and the enemy was close. And Evrinosh smiled in the darkness because he was alive and his wife was safe and his sword was sharp and the man he served was worthy of his service. And in this world, in this time, that was enough. It was more than enough. And the story continued because the story always continues, because the men and women who inhabit it refuse to stop, refuse to surrender, refuse to accept that the darkness is permanent or that the dawn will not come. And they fight and they love and they grieve and they hope and they press forward into the unknown with the stubborn, magnificent, heartbreaking courage that is the only answer any human being has ever found to the question that the universe asks every living soul, every single day. Without exception and without mercy, the question that is not spoken in words but in the relentless passage of time and the constant presence of danger and the beautiful, terrible uncertainty of what comes next. Will you continue? And the only answer, the answer that Orhan Sahib gave and that Turhan gave and that Evrinosh gave and that Fatima gave and that Darsan gave and that Asporça gave and that every soul who ever stood upon these walls or rode through these forests or prayed in these mosques or loved beneath these stars has always given, now and forever and without end is yes. Yes. We continue. The valley swallowed Darsan and his companions the way the sea swallows a stone, completely and without ceremony. And the darkness that closed around them as they descended from the ridge was not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom or the familiar darkness of a city street after the lamps have been extinguished, but the absolute primordial darkness of a land that has never been tamed, a darkness that pressed against the eyes and filled the lungs and seemed to have weight and texture and intention. As though the night itself were a living thing that had been waiting for them and was now drawing them deeper into its body with the patient, inexorable pull of gravity. Darsan rode at the front of the column, and his horse moved with the hesitant, careful gait of an animal navigating terrain it could feel but not see, each hoof placed with deliberate precision, each step tested before weight was committed, and the sound of 6 horses moving through the darkness was louder than it should have been, amplified by the stone walls of the valley and the absolute stillness of the air, so that every creak of leather, every clink of metal against metal, every snort and stamp seemed to announce their presence to the entire world. Darsan was aware of this, painfully aware, and he had considered dismounting and leading the horses on foot, which would have been quieter but slower, and speed was a factor that could not be ignored, because every hour that passed was an hour in which the escaped soldier from the training camp might be reporting to Daimir Khan, an hour in which the Karasi forces might be repositioning, an hour in which the window of opportunity that Darsan was riding toward might be narrowing to nothing. Sinos rode directly behind him, and the young man's breathing was audible in the silence, quick and shallow, the breathing of someone whose body is pumping adrenaline in preparation for a fight that has not yet begun. And Darsan recognized this sound because he had heard it from young soldiers before every engagement he had ever been part of, the sound of courage assembling itself, gathering its components from the scattered corners of the body and the mind, preparing to present itself as a unified force at the moment when it would be needed most. Behind Sinos rode the 4 other men, veterans all, their silence a testament to the experience that had taught them that noise in enemy territory was not merely imprudent but potentially fatal, and they moved through the darkness like ghosts, present but invisible, substantial but soundless, and the column advanced toward the village with the slow, measured pace of men who understood that the next few minutes might be the most important of their lives. The dogs had stopped barking. This was significant because dogs that bark at an approaching stranger will continue barking until the stranger arrives or departs, and dogs that stop barking have either been silenced or have accepted the approaching presence as familiar. And neither possibility was comforting, because the first suggested that someone in the village was expecting visitors and had taken steps to prevent the alarm from spreading, and the second suggested that Darsan's approach had been detected and identified, which meant that his element of surprise, such as it was, had already been compromised. He raised his hand and the column halted, the horses stopping with the trained obedience of military mounts, and Darsan sat motionless in the saddle and listened. The silence was not truly silent. Beneath the apparent stillness, there were layers of sound, the faint rustle of wind through the bare branches overhead, the distant trickle of water from the stream that cut through the center of the valley, the barely audible hum of domestic activity from the village, the sounds of pots being moved and doors being closed and children being put to bed, the sounds of normalcy that were simultaneously reassuring and heartbreaking. Because they reminded Darsan that the people he was about to involve in his rebellion were not abstractions on a strategic map, but real human beings with real lives, lives that his actions might preserve or destroy depending on how the next few hours unfolded. He dismounted and gestured for the others to do the same, and they tied the horses to a stand of young trees at the edge of a clearing and continued on foot, moving in single file along a path that Darsan remembered from childhood, a path that wound through a thicket of brambles and emerged at the back of Koroglu's house, a route that he had used as a boy when he came to visit Koroglu's son, who had been his closest friend during the summers when the Karasi chieftain's family would camp in this valley, and the children of the settlement would teach the chieftain's sons the skills and games of rural life that were so different from the formal education they received at court. Koroglu's son was dead now, killed 2 years ago in a skirmish with Byzantine raiders along the western border, and his death was one of the many small tragedies that had accumulated over the years and had gradually eroded Koroglu's faith in the leadership that was supposed to protect his people, but that seemed increasingly interested in allying with the very power that had killed his child. Darsan knew this, and he knew that grief, properly channeled, could be a more powerful motivator than any political argument, and he intended to use this knowledge not as a weapon of manipulation but as a bridge of shared understanding, because Darsan too had lost things, not a son but a family, a home, and identity, and the loss connected him to Koroglu in a way that transcended the hierarchies and formalities that normally governed their relationship. They reached the back of Koroglu's house, and Darsan crouched behind the low stone wall that enclosed the small garden where Koroglu's wife grew herbs and vegetables, and he peered over the wall at the house, at the warm light spilling from the single window that faced the garden, at the shadow that moved behind the shutters, a human shape going about the business of an ordinary evening, and he felt a surge of something that was part guilt and part determination, because he was about to shatter this ordinary evening. To introduce into this quiet domestic scene the chaos and danger of the political world that existed beyond the valley walls, and there was no way to do this gently, no way to wrap the reality of what he was asking in enough kindness to make it painless. He told Sinos and the others to wait, to stay hidden behind the wall, and to intervene only if he gave the signal. And then he rose from his crouch and walked around the wall to the front of the house and knocked on the door with 3 sharp raps, the same knock he had used as a boy, 3 quick strikes followed by a pause and then 2 more, a pattern that Koroglu and his family would recognize even after years of absence, a knock that said, "It is me, it is someone you know, it is safe to open the door." The silence that followed the knock lasted for what felt like an eternity but was probably no more than 10 seconds, and then there was the sound of movement inside the house. The scrape of a chair being pushed back, the heavy tread of a large man crossing a stone floor, and the door opened, and Koroglu stood in the doorway framed by the warm light behind him, and his face underwent a series of transformations in rapid succession, first surprise, then recognition, then alarm. And then something more complex, something that combined all 3 with an additional element that might have been hope or might have been fear. Because in this moment, standing at the threshold of his own home, looking at the face of a man he had known since childhood but who was now a fugitive and a rebel, Koroglu was being asked to make a choice that would define the rest of his life, and the weight of that choice was visible in his eyes, heavy and dark and shimmering with the reflected light of the fire behind him. Darsan spoke first because the silence was becoming dangerous, and he spoke quietly, his voice pitched low enough to carry no further than the doorway. And he said Koroglu's name, just the name, nothing else, and the name carried within it all the history between them. All the summers in the valley, all the shared meals and shared stories and the shared grief of Koroglu's son's death. And the older man heard all of this in a single word and his face softened. The alarm fading into something that was closer to resignation. The resignation of a man who has been expecting a knock on his door and is almost relieved that it has finally come. Koroglu stepped aside and Darsan entered, and the door closed behind him, and the night outside settled back into its silence. And Sinos, crouching behind the garden wall with his hand on his sword, began the slow, excruciating process of waiting that is the soldier's most common experience and most difficult skill, the skill of doing nothing while everything inside you screams to act. Inside the house, Darsan sat across from Koroglu at a rough wooden table, and between them a single oil lamp burned with a flame that flickered in the drafts that crept through the gaps in the shutters, and the shadows it cast were restless, shifting across the walls and the ceiling like living things, and Koroglu's wife, a woman whose name was Aish and whose face bore the premature aging that comes from hard work and harder grief, stood in the doorway of the back room, her hands clasped before her. Her eyes moving between her husband and his visitor with the sharp, assessing gaze of a woman who has learned to read the currents of male conversation for the signs of danger that men themselves often fail to recognize. Koroglu did not speak immediately. He poured 2 cups of tea from a pot that had been warming on the hearth, and the ritual of pouring and serving was a necessary delay, a way of creating space for thought, a way of honoring the tradition of hospitality that required a host to offer sustenance before asking questions, and Darsan accepted the tea and drank, and the warmth of it spread through his body like a slow fire, thawing the cold that had settled into his bones during the ride through the darkness. It was Koroglu who broke the silence, and his voice was deep and rough, the voice of a man who spent his days outdoors, shouting orders across training grounds and hillsides, a voice that had been shaped by wind and weather and the accumulated weight of years. He said that he had heard about the raid on the training camp, that the news had reached the village before sunset, carried by a rider whose horse was half dead with exhaustion and whose face was white with the shock of what he had witnessed. He said that the rider had told them Darsan had come with Ottoman fighters, that they had beaten the garrison with wooden staves, that they had offered the soldiers a choice between surrender and loyalty, and that most had chosen neither, simply standing in confusion while the world they had known rearranged itself around them. Darsan confirmed the broad outline of this account and then told the full story, holding nothing back, because honesty was the only currency he had and the only currency that would matter to a man like Koroglu, who had spent his life in the company of soldiers and who could detect a lie the way a hunting dog detects a scent, instinctively and infallibly. He told Koroglu about his growing unease with Daimir Khan's leadership, about the alliance with the Şahinşah, about the secret meetings with Byzantine envoys that he had witnessed but had not been invited to attend, about the gradual realization that his brother was not pursuing the interests of the Karasi people but his own interests, using the Karasi military as a bargaining chip in a game whose stakes were measured not in land or honor but in personal power. He told Koroglu about the decision to break away, about the terror of that decision and the liberation that followed it, about the night he had lain awake in his tent and stared at the canvas above him and understood with a clarity that was almost physical, like a hand gripping his heart, that he could not continue to serve a cause he did not believe in, that loyalty to blood was not the same as loyalty to principle, and that when the two came into conflict, a man had to choose. And the choice defined him more completely than any title or bloodline ever could. Koroglu listened to all of this without interrupting, his face impassive, his hands wrapped around his teacup, and the steam rising from the cup caught the lamplight and created small, ephemeral shapes in the air between them, shapes that formed and dissolved in the space of a breath. And Darsan watched these shapes as he spoke, finding in their transience a metaphor for the alliances and loyalties that he was describing, things that seemed solid and permanent but that were in fact as fragile and as temporary as steam. When Darsan finished, Koroglu was silent for a long time, and the silence was not hostile but contemplative, the silence of a man who is processing information of enormous significance and who will not speak until he is certain of what he wants to say. Aish remained in the doorway, her presence a reminder that the consequences of whatever was decided at this table would extend beyond the men who sat at it, would reach into the households and families of every soldier who chose to follow Darsan or to remain with Daimir Khan, would touch the lives of women and children who had no voice in the councils of war, but who would bear the heaviest burden of whatever those councils decided. Koroglu spoke at last, and his words were measured and deliberate, each one placed with the care of a mason placing stones in a wall. He said that Darsan was not telling him anything he did not already know, that the doubts Darsan described were doubts he had been carrying for months, doubts that had grown heavier with each passing week, doubts that had kept him awake at night and that had made him short-tempered with his men and distant with his wife, and consumed by a restless, directionless anger that he could neither express nor suppress. He said that when his son died fighting Byzantines, he had believed that his son's death had meaning, that it was a sacrifice made in defense of something worth defending, but that Daimir Khan's alliance with the very people who had killed his son had stripped that death of its meaning, had turned it from a sacrifice into a waste, and that this, more than any strategic argument or political calculation, was what had poisoned his loyalty and left him standing at the edge of a decision that he was afraid to make. He said he was afraid. He said it plainly without shame because Koroglu was a man who had fought in enough battles to know that courage was not the absence of fear but the refusal to be governed by it, and admitting his fear was itself an act of courage, a way of acknowledging the reality of his situation without allowing that reality to paralyze him. He was afraid because he had a wife and a household to protect, because the men who served under him looked to him for guidance and would follow him wherever he led, even into ruin, and the responsibility of leading men to their potential destruction was a weight that no decent person could carry lightly. He was afraid because Daimir Khan was not a forgiving man, and defection would be met not with disappointment but with retribution, swift and savage, and calculated to serve as a warning to anyone else who might be considering a similar path. Darsan listened to this confession of fear with a respect that was visible in his posture, in the way he leaned forward and held Koroglu's gaze without flinching. And when the older man had finished, Darsan said something that surprised both of them because it was not what he had planned to say, and it came not from the strategic calculations he had been rehearsing during the ride but from somewhere deeper, somewhere more honest, somewhere that even Darsan had not fully explored until this moment. He said that he was afraid too. He said that he had been afraid every day since the decision to break away, that the fear had not diminished with time but had changed its shape, evolving from the raw, immediate fear of physical danger into a subtler, more insidious fear. The fear of being wrong, the fear that his principles were nothing more than pride dressed in moral clothing, the fear that he was leading good men into a disaster that could have been avoided if he had simply kept his head down and done as he was told. He said that this fear was his constant companion, that it rode with him and ate with him and slept beside him, and that the only thing that kept it from consuming him entirely was the knowledge that the alternative of silent complicity, of watching his brother betray their people while he stood by and said nothing, was worse than any consequence that might follow from resistance. He looked at Koroglu and said that he was not asking the older man to set aside his fear but to carry it with him, as Darsan carried his own, and to act despite it, because the world does not wait for men to become brave before it demands brave things of them. And the choice that Koroglu faced tonight was the kind of choice that comes only once in a lifetime. The kind of choice that determines not just what a man does but who he is, and the moment for making it would not return once it had passed. Koroglu looked at Darsan and then he looked at his wife, and the communication that passed between husband and wife in that glance was the kind of communication that 20 years of marriage creates. A language without words, a transmission of meaning that operates below the level of conscious thought, and Aish held his gaze and gave a nod so slight that it was barely perceptible. And in that nod was everything: her consent, her trust, her fear, her love, and the understanding that whatever happened next, they would face it together as they had faced everything else in their lives together, with the stubbornness and the tenderness and the fierce, unbreakable commitment that is the foundation of every marriage that survives the tests that the world throws at it. Koroglu turned back to Darsan and said that he would need time, not much time, but enough to speak with certain men he trusted, men whose doubts he had sensed in the way that an experienced commander senses the mood of his troops, through the quality of their silences and the tone of their laughter and the small, almost imperceptible changes in behavior that signal the onset of disillusionment. He said that there were at least a dozen such men within his immediate command, and perhaps more within the broader Karasi structure, men who would respond to the argument that Darsan had just made because it gave voice to the unease they had been carrying in silence. And he said that he would begin making contact with them tomorrow, quietly and carefully, because a conspiracy that moves too fast attracts attention, and a conspiracy that attracts attention is already defeated. Darsan accepted this timeline and asked Koroglu one more question, a question whose answer would determine the scope and the potential of the entire operation. He asked whether Koroglu believed it was possible to reach the elder Karasi chieftain, Darsan's own father, to make the case to him directly, to appeal not to his political judgment, which had been compromised by Daimir Khan's influence, but to his honor, to the code of conduct that he had been raised to uphold, and that he had taught his sons before the world had complicated everything. Koroglu's answer was slow in coming and careful in its construction. He said that the elder chieftain was not an evil man, that he was not motivated by greed or ambition the way Daimir Khan was, but that he had been gradually isolated from the reality of what was happening in his own territory, surrounded by advisors who told him what Daimir Khan wanted him to hear, and shielded from the dissent and doubt that were spreading through the ranks of his own military. He said that reaching the chieftain was possible but dangerous, because the men who controlled access to him were Daimir Khan's loyalists, and any attempt to communicate with the chieftain directly would be reported and responded to with force. But he also said that there were still a few people in the chieftain's immediate household who were loyal to the old ways, to the principles that had governed the Karasi before Daimir Khan's ambition had corrupted them, and that if a message could be placed in the right hands, it might reach the chieftain's ears without passing through Daimir Khan's filter. Darsan filed this information away with the meticulous care of a man who understood that the difference between success and failure in this kind of operation often depended on details so small that they could be overlooked by anyone who was not paying the closest possible attention. He thanked Koroglu, not with words but with a clasp of the forearm that was the traditional greeting and farewell of Karasi warriors, a gesture that carried within it the full weight of shared history and shared purpose, and then he rose from the table and moved toward the door. Aish stopped him with a hand on his arm, and she pressed into his hand a small cloth bundle that contained bread and dried meat, and a handful of dried apricots, provisions for the journey back, and the gesture was so simple and so human that it cut through the accumulated tension of the evening like a shaft of sunlight through a cloud. And Darsan thanked her with his eyes because his voice had temporarily abandoned him. Overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness of a woman who had every reason to resent his presence and the danger it brought but who had chosen instead to feed him, because feeding people is what women like Aish do, it is their answer to the chaos of the world, their refusal to accept that the bonds of community can be severed by politics and war, their insistence that as long as there is bread to share and tea to pour, the fundamental human connection will survive. Darsan left the house and found Sinos and the others where he had left them, crouched behind the garden wall, their hands on their weapons, their faces tight with the strain of prolonged vigilance, and he gave them a brief nod that communicated the essential outcome of the meeting without requiring a verbal report, and they rose and followed him back through the brambles and up the path to where the horses were tied, and they mounted and rode out of the valley the way they had come, and the darkness closed around them again. But this time it felt different, less hostile, less oppressive, because they were carrying with them something that had not existed an hour ago, a possibility, a thread of hope, thin and fragile but real. And the ride back to Bursa was conducted in a silence that was no longer the silence of apprehension, but the silence of men who are thinking about the future and finding in it, for the first time in weeks, something other than dread. While Darsan's diplomatic mission was unfolding in the northern hills, the situation on the eastern front was developing in ways that exceeded even Jurkutai's most optimistic projections. The deception campaign was working, and it was working better than anyone had anticipated, because the garrison at Chanali was not merely alert but actively panicking. And the messages being sent to Daimir Khan were not measured assessments of a potential threat but desperate pleas for reinforcement that painted a picture of an Ottoman army of terrifying size and capability bearing down upon them with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. Jurkutai received reports of this panic from his own scouts, men who had infiltrated close enough to the fortress to observe the movements of the garrison and to intercept the riders carrying messages to Daimir Khan, and the reports brought a smile to his weathered face, the satisfied smile of a craftsman who has built something and is watching it function exactly as designed. But the smile was tempered by the awareness that deceptions have a natural lifespan, that the longer the fiction was maintained, the greater the risk that someone in the garrison would summon the courage to send out a reconnaissance patrol that would discover the truth, and that when the truth was discovered, the reaction would be swift and furious, driven by the humiliation of having been fooled and the desire to make the men responsible for the deception pay for their audacity. Jurkutai was prepared for this. He had positioned his fastest riders at the forward edge of the deception line, mounted on the freshest horses, with orders to withdraw at the first sign of an enemy probe, leading any pursuing force on a chase that would take them in circles through the forest, always staying just ahead of their pursuers, always visible enough to be followed but never close enough to be caught, a tantalizing quarry that would keep the garrison's attention focused outward while the deception behind them continued to grow and evolve. And there was another element to the plan that Jurkutai had not shared with the War Council, an element that he had conceived on his own during the ride east and that he had implemented without seeking permission, because Jurkutai was the kind of soldier who believed that plans were starting points rather than scripts, and that a commander who could not adapt to circumstances in real time was a commander who deserved the defeat that inflexibility invariably produced. He had dispatched two of his most experienced men on a separate mission, a mission that had nothing to do with fire or noise or the theatrical simulation of a large army, but that might, if successful, produce a result worth more than all the deception fires in the world. These two men, whose names were Bahram and Kemal, had been selected for a specific combination of skills. Bahram for his ability to move through hostile territory without being detected, and Kemal for his ability to talk his way out of situations that detection inevitably created. And their mission was to reach the fortress of Chanali itself, not to attack it or to spy on it from a distance, but to enter it. To pass through its gates disguised as traders or refugees or whatever cover story seemed most plausible at the moment, and to make contact with the garrison soldiers, not the commanders but the ordinary men, the ones who stood on the walls and looked out at the fires and felt in their guts the cold weight of fear that comes from facing an enemy you cannot see and cannot count and cannot predict. Bahram and Kemal would offer these men a choice, the same choice that Darsan had offered the soldiers at the training camp, the choice between continued service to a commander who had allied himself with the enemies of their faith and their people, and the alternative of aligning themselves with the Ottoman cause, which offered not just military superiority but moral clarity, the assurance that the fight they were fighting was the right fight, fought for the right reasons, on the right side of the line that divides justice from injustice. This was a gamble, and Jurkutai knew it. If Bahram and Kemal were caught, they would be killed, and the manner of their killing would be designed to send a message to anyone else who might be contemplating defection. But Jurkutai had weighed this risk against the potential reward, and the calculation had come out in favor of action, because the garrison at Chanali was not a monolithic block of committed fighters but a collection of individuals, each with his own fears and doubts and loyalties, and a collection of individuals can be disassembled, one at a time, from the inside out, in ways that no external force, no matter how powerful, can replicate. Back in Bursa, the day had settled into the tense, productive rhythm of a city preparing for war while trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy. The market was open, but the stalls that usually sold luxuries, silk and jewelry and imported spices were doing less business than the stalls that sold practical goods, rope and leather, and the heavy wool cloth that soldiers used for cloaks and blankets. The bread ovens were working overtime, producing not just the day's supply but surplus loaves that were being dried and stored in the granaries alongside the existing reserves, because Tarhin had calculated the provisions needed to sustain the city for a 30-day siege, and had found the current supplies inadequate by a margin that was not catastrophic but was concerning enough to warrant immediate action. The blacksmiths were working in shifts, their hammers ringing from dawn to midnight, producing arrowheads and spearpoints and the small metal components, buckles and rivets and chain links that kept an army's equipment functional. The bowyers were inspecting their inventory of bows and culling any that showed signs of weakness, cracked limbs or loose wrappings or the subtle warping that comes from improper storage. Because a bow that breaks at the moment of release is worse than no bow at all, since it betrays the trust of the archer who depended on it. And the horse masters were evaluating every mount in the city's stables, assessing their fitness for campaign work, identifying those that needed additional feeding or rest before they could be relied upon for the sustained effort that combat demanded. Tarhin oversaw all of this with the comprehensive attention of a man who understood that an army's effectiveness was determined not by the courage of its soldiers, but by the quality of its logistics, that a warrior who has not eaten is a warrior who cannot fight, that a sword that has not been sharpened is a sword that will fail at the moment of greatest need, and that the distance between victory and defeat was often measured not in miles or men but in meals and arrows and the small, unglamorous details that generals ignore at their peril. He was inspecting the western earthworks when Evranash found him, and the younger man's face bore an expression that Tarhin recognized immediately, the expression of a soldier who has something to report and is not sure how it will be received. Evranash had been riding the perimeter with a patrol of 8 men, checking the sight lines from the new defensive positions and testing the responsiveness of the signal fire network. And during this patrol, he had encountered something unexpected: a small group of civilians, 3 men and 2 women, traveling west along the road from Bursa, their possessions loaded on a single donkey, their faces bearing the unmistakable look of people who are leaving a place they do not expect to return to. Evranash had stopped them and asked where they were going, and they had told him, with the resigned honesty of people who have nothing left to lose by telling the truth, that they were leaving Bursa because they had heard that war was coming, and they did not want to be inside the city when it arrived. They said that others were planning to leave as well, that the talk in the marketplaces and the tea houses was not of celebration anymore but of fear, and that the Sultan's war council, which was supposed to have been secret, was already common knowledge, its details discussed and debated and distorted by the rumor mill that operates in every community with the efficiency and the reliability of a water wheel. Tarhin received this report with the grim acceptance of a man who knew that civilian flight was both natural and dangerous. Natural because fear was a reasonable response to the threat of siege, and dangerous because a city that lost its civilian population lost not just the labor that those civilians provided but the moral foundation upon which the defense was built, because soldiers fight harder when they are defending people. When they can look behind them and see the faces of the women and children and elderly whose lives depend on the strength of the wall they are holding. And a city emptied of its civilians is a city that has already begun to surrender. He told Evranash to let the departing civilians pass without obstruction, because a sultan who imprisons his own people behind the walls of a city they wish to leave is a tyrant, not a protector, and the distinction mattered both morally and practically. But he also told Evranash to make a note of every person who left, their names and their occupations and their destinations, because when the crisis was over one way or another, the community would need to be reassembled, and knowing where its members had scattered was the first step in gathering them back. And then Tarhin added something else, something that revealed the depth of his understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. He told Evranash to spread the word quietly and through trusted channels that the Sultan was not afraid, that the preparations being made were not the preparations of a cornered animal but the preparations of a predator, and that anyone who chose to remain in Bursa would be under the personal protection of Orhan Sahib, whose record of defending those who trusted him was unblemished, and whose strength had been tested by enemies far more formidable than those currently gathering beyond the horizon. This message was not propaganda, or rather it was propaganda in the truest sense of the word, the propagation of a truth that needed to be heard, because the people of Bursa needed a reason to stay, and the most powerful reason that could be offered was the assurance that the man they had entrusted with their safety was equal to the challenge. Evranash nodded and rode off to execute these instructions, and Tarhin returned to his inspection of the earthworks, and the afternoon light, thin and gray and tinged with the blue of approaching winter, fell across the trenches and the stakes in the raw, newly turned earth with the impartial illumination that sunlight provides to all things equally, the beautiful and the brutal, the work of love and the work of war. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky with colors that ranged from pale gold to deep amber to the rich, dark purple that presaged the coming night, Orhan Sahib climbed to the highest point of the palace, a narrow tower that had been built not for defense but for observation, a place where the Sultan could stand above the city and see the land spread out around him in every direction. The cultivated fields and the wild forests and the distant mountains and the roads that connected Bursa to the rest of the world, roads that carried commerce and culture and knowledge in times of peace and armies and destruction in times of war. He stood at the top of the tower and looked east, toward Chanali and the fires that he knew Jurkutai was maintaining, and he thought about the men who were out there in the darkness, 50 men pretending to be 1,000, risking their lives on the quality of a lie, and he felt the weight of their trust pressing down upon him like a physical burden, because every man who followed his orders was a man whose life was in his hands, and the hands of a sultan are never clean, no matter how just his cause. Because leadership requires the sacrifice of others, and the sacrifice of others is a debt that can never be fully repaid. He looked north toward the Karasi territory, toward Darsun and the impossible mission of turning a divided people into a united one. And he thought about the young man who had given up everything, family and home and name, and the comfortable certainty of belonging, in exchange for the cold, exposed freedom of conscience, and he felt a kinship with Darsan that went beyond the political alliance they had formed. Because Orhan himself had known what it was to stand alone against the weight of expectation and tradition, to make a choice that the world condemned and that only the future could vindicate. He looked west, toward the gathering threat of the Byzantine forces and the shadow of the European crusade that hung over everything like a cloud that might or might not burst into storm. And he measured this threat not with the detached calculation of a strategist, but with the visceral, gut-level instinct of a fighter who has spent his life gauging the strength and intention of his opponents. And what he saw in the West was not an insurmountable force, but a coalition of interests that were united only by their opposition to him. A coalition whose internal contradictions were as dangerous to its members as its combined strength was to the Ottoman state. The Şahinşah wanted to reclaim territory, the Pope wanted to reclaim souls, Daimir Khan wanted to reclaim power. These three desires were aligned in the short term but fundamentally incompatible in the long term, because territory reclaimed by the Byzantines would not be shared with the Pope's crusaders, and power reclaimed by Daimir Khan would not be subordinated to either the Şahinşah's authority or the Pope's spiritual jurisdiction. And the moment the common enemy was removed, the alliance would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Its members turning on each other with the ferocity that only former allies can muster. This was the strategic insight that governed Orhan's thinking, the understanding that time was on his side if he could survive the initial assault, that every day the alliance held together was a day closer to the moment when it would fall apart, and that his task was therefore not to destroy the alliance but to endure it, to absorb its attacks and deflect its thrusts and outlast its cohesion, fighting not for a decisive victory but for the kind of stubborn, resilient, inch-by-inch defense that exhausts an attacker's patience and exposes the fault lines in his coalition. Survival required preparation, and preparation required resources, and resources required time. And time was the one thing that was not available in unlimited quantities, because the Şahinşah was not a patient man, and the soldiers gathering in the West were not gathering to wait, and the crusade that the Pope was promising was not an abstract threat but a concrete possibility that was growing more likely with each day that passed. And Orhan knew, with the certainty that comes from long experience, that the next few weeks would be the most dangerous of his reign, that the decisions he made and the actions he took during this narrow window would determine not just his own fate but the fate of everyone who depended on him, which was, at this point, everyone in Bursa and everyone in every settlement and garrison and outpost that flew the Ottoman banner. He stood at the top of the tower for a long time, watching the light change, watching the shadows lengthen, watching the fires appear on the city walls below him as the night watch took up their positions, and the solitude was both a burden and a relief, because at the top of this tower there were no advisors to consult and no generals to argue with and no civilians to reassure. There was only the wind and the sky and the distant, muted sounds of the city, and in this isolation, Orhan could think with a clarity that was impossible in the noisy, crowded world below. He thought about Asporça, who was even now preparing for her journey into the heart of enemy territory, and he thought about the courage required for a woman to walk back into a world that had rejected her and to carry a message that could get her killed, and he thought about whether he had the right to send her, whether the strategic value of her mission justified the risk to her life, and the answer was the same answer it always was. The answer that every leader who sends someone into danger must eventually accept, which is that the right is not his to give or withhold but belongs to the person who volunteers, and Asporça had volunteered, and her decision was her own, and his obligation was not to protect her from her own courage, but to ensure that her courage was not wasted. He descended from the tower and returned to the palace, and the corridors were quieter now, the frenetic activity of the day giving way to the more measured rhythms of evening, and he passed through rooms where maps were being updated and messages were being decoded and supplies were being counted. And every person he passed straightened slightly at his approach, not out of fear but out of the deep instinctive respect that a good leader earns through years of consistent behavior, the respect that says we trust you. We follow you, we believe that you will do what is right, and this trust was the most precious resource Orhan possessed, more valuable than any fortress or any army, because trust is the foundation upon which everything else is built, and without it the strongest walls are nothing but obstacles waiting to become ruins. He found Asporça in her quarters, sitting beside a small trunk that contained the few possessions she would take with her, and she was looking at a piece of jewelry, a necklace that had been given to her by her grandfather when she was a child, a simple gold chain with a pendant in the shape of the Byzantine double-headed eagle, and the expression on her face was one that Orhan had seen many times before. The expression of a person who is about to leave behind everything familiar and step into a world of uncertainty, and who is trying to hold on to one small piece of the past as a talisman against the unknown future. He sat beside her, and the act of sitting, of bringing himself to her level rather than standing above her as protocol would have permitted, was a gesture of equality and intimacy that Asporça recognized and appreciated. And for a moment they were not a sultan and a princess but two people sitting side by side in a small room, sharing the weight of decisions that neither of them had asked to make, but that both of them had accepted as their own. Orhan told her that she did not have to go, that he would find another way, that there were always other ways, and he meant it, because the words were not a test or a manipulation but a genuine offer, the offer of a man who cared about the person sitting beside him and who wanted her to know that her value was not measured solely by her usefulness. Asporça looked at him, and her eyes were clear and dry, the tears of the previous day having been spent and replaced by a resolve that was harder and more durable than grief. And she told him that she was going, that the decision was made, that her grandfather's death demanded a response, and this mission was that response, not revenge but justice, not destruction but truth. And she would carry the truth into the heart of the Byzantine court and let it do its work, because truth, properly placed, is more explosive than any weapon. She closed the trunk and fastened its clasps, and the click of the metal was like the sound of a chapter ending and a new one beginning. And Orhan placed his hand over hers for a moment, a brief contact that communicated everything that needed to be communicated. And then he rose and left the room, and Asporça sat alone with her trunk and her necklace and her resolve, and the candle beside her burned steadily, its flame untroubled by any draught, and the shadows it cast were still. The night deepened, and the city of Bursa settled into the uneasy sleep of a community that knows it is being watched. And beyond the walls, in the forests and on the roads and in the camps where armies were gathering and alliances were being tested, the great machinery of conflict continued its relentless turning, each cog meshing with the next, each movement producing the next movement. Each decision cascading into consequences that would ripple outward through time and space until the full shape of the future was revealed. A shape that no one could predict and that everyone feared, and that Orhan Sahib, standing alone in his chamber with his sword across his knees and his eyes closed, was determined to master through the only means available to him, the application of will and wisdom and the stubborn, unbreakable refusal to accept defeat. Far to the east, in the darkness of the forest, Bey'in and Kemal had reached the approaches to Chanali, and the fortress loomed above them in the night, its walls dark and massive against the sky, its torches burning at intervals along the ramparts, creating pools of light that illuminated the faces of the sentries who walked between them. The two men had changed out of their military gear and into the rough clothing of traveling merchants, and they carried between them a pack of trade goods, bolts of cloth and small tools, and a selection of dried medicinal herbs, the kind of merchandise that a merchant might reasonably be carrying through the region, and that would justify their presence on the road without arousing suspicion. They approached the main gate as the first watch was being changed, a moment of transition and distraction that they had chosen deliberately, because the changing of the guard created a brief window of reduced attention during which the outgoing sentries were focused on their relief, and the incoming sentries were focused on the ritual of assuming their posts, and neither group was giving the gate itself the scrutiny it would normally receive. Bey'in went first, walking with the slightly stooped, weary gait of a man who has been traveling for days and wants nothing more than a warm fire and a flat surface to sleep on. And his performance was convincing because it was barely a performance at all, since he was genuinely exhausted and genuinely wanted a warm fire. He approached the gate guard and offered the traditional greeting and explained that he and his companion were merchants traveling from the south, that they had been delayed by the unrest on the roads, that they needed shelter for the night and would be grateful for the hospitality of the garrison, and that they had goods to trade that might be of interest to the soldiers, who he imagined were as eager for fresh supplies as any men stationed in a remote fortress during uncertain times. The gate guard looked at him with the flat, suspicious gaze of a man whose entire job consisted of deciding who was allowed through the gate and who was not. And Bey'in met this gaze with the open, slightly anxious expression of a man who has nothing to hide, but who is aware that not hiding anything is no guarantee of not being suspected of hiding something, which is the perpetual paradox of the innocent in times of war, and the guard held the gaze for several long seconds, during which Bey'in's heart hammered against his ribs with a force that he was certain must be audible to everyone within 50 feet, and then the guard waved them through, because the garrison needed supplies and merchants were welcome, and the fires on the eastern horizon were occupying far more of the garrison's collective attention than two tired traders with a pack of cloth. Inside the fortress, Bey'in and Kemal set up their modest display of goods in a corner of the main courtyard, and the soldiers who were not on duty drifted over to inspect what they had to offer, and the conversations that followed were the conversations of bored, frightened men who were grateful for any distraction from the anxiety that was pressing down upon them like a physical weight. The soldiers talked about the fires in the east, about the size of the approaching army, about the messages that had been sent to Daimir Khan requesting reinforcements and the responses that had or had not been received. And Bey'in and Kemal listened to everything, absorbing every detail, measuring every word for its intelligence value, while simultaneously building the rapport that would be necessary for the more delicate conversations that would follow. They traded cloth for information and herbs for confidence and small tools for trust. And as the night wore on and the guard changed and the courtyard emptied and the soldiers who remained were the ones who could not sleep, the ones whose minds were too active and whose fears were too loud for rest, Bey'in and Kemal began to steer the conversations in a different direction, away from the external threat and toward the internal doubts that they knew existed beneath the surface of military discipline. They asked questions that were innocent on the surface but loaded with implication. Questions about why the garrison was here, about what they were defending and for whom, about whether the alliance with the Şahinşah was really in the best interests of the Karasi people or whether it served only the ambitions of one man, one family, one faction. They did not press these questions or demand answers, because a man who's being recruited does not respond well to pressure. Instead, they planted the questions like seeds in soil, dropping them into the conversation and then moving on, allowing them to take root in the darkness of each man's private thoughts, where they would germinate and grow and eventually produce the fruit of doubt, which is the precursor to the fruit of decision. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Bayram and Kemal had identified 3 soldiers whose doubts were advanced enough to be approached directly, men whose answers to the casual questions had been a beat too slow or a shade too careful, men who had looked around before responding as though checking whether they were being observed, men whose body language carried the subtle signs of internal conflict that only a trained observer would recognize. These 3 would be the starting point, the first cracks in the wall of the garrison's loyalty, and from these cracks, with patience and persistence, the entire wall might eventually be brought down. But this was a process that would take days, perhaps weeks, and time was the commodity that was in shortest supply. And Bayram and Kemal knew that they were operating in a space between discovery and success that was narrowing with every hour, because the deception fires could not burn forever, and when they went out, the garrison would learn the truth, and the truth would be a harsh teacher. And the men who had been friendly to the merchants would suddenly remember every question they had been asked, and every answer they had given, and the consequences would be swift and terrible. Far to the west, in the Byzantine camp, the Şahinşah received 2 pieces of intelligence on the same morning, and the contrast between them produced an emotional whiplash that left him staring at his advisors with an expression that combined fury and calculation in roughly equal proportions. The first piece of intelligence was from Demir Khan, reporting the approach of a large Ottoman force toward Chanali and requesting instructions on whether to reinforce the garrison or to withdraw and consolidate his forces at a more defensible position. This was good news from the Şahinşah's perspective because it suggested that Orhan was committing his forces to the east, which meant the western approach to Bursa was weakening, which meant the moment for a Byzantine advance was approaching. The second piece of intelligence was from his own spies within the Ottoman court, and it reported something that the Şahinşah had not expected and was not prepared for: the departure of Asporça from Bursa, traveling west with a small escort, her destination unknown but her direction unmistakable, heading toward the Byzantine border, heading toward home, heading toward the court from which she had been taken and to which she was now apparently returning. And the Şahinşah could not determine whether this was a trap or a gift, an attack or an offer, a threat or an opportunity, and the uncertainty was maddening, because he was a man who preferred his enemies to be predictable and his strategies to be based on certainties rather than guesses. He summoned Mahmud, and the 2 men sat in the gray morning light of the imperial tent and discussed the implications of Asporça's journey, and the discussion was the kind of intense, rapid-fire exchange that occurs between 2 minds that are perfectly matched in intelligence and ruthlessness, each building on the other's insights, each challenging the other's assumptions, each probing for weaknesses in the reasoning that might lead to a flawed conclusion. Mahmud argued that Asporça was being sent as a diplomatic agent, that her mission was to contact sympathizers within the Byzantine aristocracy and to foment internal opposition to the Şahinşah's rule, using the death of the former emperor as a rallying point for those who had never accepted the legitimacy of his deposition. The Şahinşah accepted this analysis but added a layer that Mahmud had not considered, that Asporça's journey might also be a deception, a visible move designed to draw the Şahinşah's attention and resources toward internal security and away from the military front, the same kind of misdirection that Jurkutai was practicing in the east, applied at a strategic rather than tactical level. The 2 possibilities were not mutually exclusive, and the Şahinşah decided to treat them as equally real, assigning agents to monitor Asporça's movements and intercept her communications while simultaneously maintaining the pressure on the military front, because a good commander does not choose between possible threats but prepares for all of them, and a great commander turns each preparation into an opportunity. He gave orders for the Byzantine forces to begin moving toward Bursa, not a full assault but a measured advance, a tightening of the circle around the city that would test the Ottoman defenses and probe for weaknesses while maintaining enough distance to avoid a premature engagement. He wanted Orhan to feel the pressure, to understand that the army in the west was not static but advancing, not waiting but approaching, and that the window of time available for Eastern adventures and diplomatic maneuvers was closing. The troops broke camp with the disciplined efficiency of a professional army, tents folded and packed on mules, weapons checked and distributed, formations assembled and inspected, and the column that moved westward along the road toward Bursa was long enough that the head of the column was already beyond the first hill before the tail had cleared the campsite. And the sound it made, the collective rumble of thousands of feet and hundreds of hooves, and the grinding creak of wagon wheels on rough road. Was the sound of inevitability, the sound of a force that had made its decision and was now executing it with the mechanical precision that is the hallmark of empires. And the trees along the road trembled as the column passed, their bare branches shaking not with wind but with the vibration of so many bodies moving in unison. And the birds that had been roosting in those trees took flight and scattered across the gray sky, and their cries were lost in the vastness above. Tarhin's scouts detected the advance within hours, their signal fires flaring one after another along the chain of hilltop positions that connected the western perimeter to the city, and the message they carried was simple and urgent: the enemy is moving, the enemy is coming, prepare. The fires were visible from the walls of Bursa, and the soldiers on the ramparts watched them appear one by one like stars being lit along the horizon, and the sight produced a tightening of the gut that every soldier knows, the physical response to the approach of danger, the body's ancient preparation for fight or flight, the surge of adrenaline that makes the hands tremble and the mouth go dry, and the world shrink to the narrow, focused tunnel of immediate reality. Tarhin was on the walls within minutes of the first signal fire, and his presence was a stabilizing force, his calm demeanor and measured voice counteracting the natural tendency of frightened men to project their fears onto their surroundings and to see in every shadow the shape of the enemy. He walked the ramparts with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man taking a leisurely stroll rather than inspecting the defenses of a city about to be attacked, and he stopped at each guard post and spoke briefly with the men stationed there, not giving orders but asking questions. How are the provisions or the fire arrows prepared? Have the signal codes been reviewed? Questions that communicated competence and concern without communicating alarm. Questions that said, I trust you to do your job, and I am here to ensure that you have everything you need to do it well. Orhan was informed immediately, and his response was characteristically decisive. He ordered the western gates sealed and the drawbridges raised, not because an attack was imminent but because the gesture itself was a statement of readiness that would be visible to any Byzantine scouts observing the city. He ordered the reserve forces, soldiers who had been held in the barracks against exactly this contingency, to arm and assemble in the main courtyard, where they would be visible from the walls, and their presence would serve as both a reassurance to the defenders and a warning to any approaching enemy. And he ordered a message sent to Jurkutai, informing him of the Byzantine advance and instructing him to maintain the deception at Chanali, but to prepare for a rapid withdrawal if the situation in the west deteriorated to the point where every available man was needed at Bursa. The city responded to these orders with the kind of organized urgency that is the product of good planning and clear leadership. The gate swung shut with a boom that echoed through the streets like a thunderclap, and the sound was heard by every person in the city, civilian and soldier alike, and it produced a silence that lasted for several heartbeats, a communal pause during which the reality of the situation impressed itself upon every consciousness with the undeniable force of a physical sensation. And then the silence broke and the city erupted into controlled activity, soldiers running to their posts, civilians securing their homes and businesses, women gathering children and moving toward the interior of the city, away from the walls, where the stone was thickest and the danger was least. Fatima heard the gates close from her quarters, and the sound passed through her body like a wave, and she stood at the window and looked out at the courtyard below, where soldiers were assembling in neat, disciplined rows, their armor glinting in the fading light, their faces set with the grim determination that comes from training and tradition. And she understood with a clarity that she had never experienced before that this was what her mother had been trying to prepare her for. This was the reality behind the celebration, the truth that the wedding had been designed in part to conceal, the truth that her husband was a soldier and her home was a fortress in her life. Her beautiful, newly begun life was balanced on the edge of a sword that was being swung by forces she could neither control nor predict. She did not cry, she would not allow herself to cry. Instead, she went to the chest where her father's archery equipment was stored, and she took out the bow that he had made for her, a smaller, lighter version of his own designed for her hands and her strength, and she strung it with practiced movements that her muscles remembered even though her mind was elsewhere, and she laid it across the table beside a quiver of arrows, and the sight of it there, dark wood and pale feathers against the polished surface of the table, was a declaration that she refused to articulate in words, but that her actions made perfectly clear. She would not wait passively for the world to decide her fate. She would participate in that decision with every skill and every ounce of courage that she possessed. And if the walls were breached, if the gates were broken, if the soldiers fell and the enemy poured into the streets of Bursa, she would be standing bow in hand between the people she loved and the people who wished them harm, and her arrows would fly true because her father had taught her well, and the ring he had given her was on her husband's finger, and the love that connected them was stronger than steel. Stronger than stone, stronger than the fear that was even now tightening around her heart like a fist. She picked up the bow and tested its draw, and the string sang a clear high note as it reached full extension, and the note hung in the air of the quiet room like a promise, and the shadows on the wall shifted as the candle flame guttered in the draft from the window. And outside, the sound of the city preparing for war filled the evening air, and Fatima stood alone in her quarters with her bow in her hands and her future in the balance and her eyes fixed on the door, waiting, ready, alive. And far away, beyond the forests and the hills and the rivers and the roads that connected the scattered pieces of this vast and complicated world, the forces that had been set in motion continued their inexorable advance, Jerkutai's fires burning in the east, the Byzantine column marching from the west, Darsun's conspiracy gestating in the north, Bahram and Kemal working their quiet subversion inside the walls of Chanali. Asporça traveling toward the enemy court with truth as her weapon and courage as her armor. And at the center of it all, in the heart of Bursa, Orhan Sahib stood in his war room with the map spread before him and the carved figures arranged in their new positions and the candle casting its steady, unwavering light across the terrain of his imagination. And he was thinking, always thinking, 3 moves ahead of the present, anticipating the moves of his enemies and preparing his responses. And his face was calm and his hands were steady, and his eyes held the fire that had burned in them since the day he first picked up a sword. The fire that was not rage and was not ambition and was not even courage, but was something deeper and more fundamental than any of these, the fire of purpose. The fire that burns in the hearts of men who know exactly what they are fighting for and exactly what they are willing to give to protect it. The night pressed against the walls of Bursa like a hand pressed against a chest, heavy and warm and insistent, and the city breathed beneath it, shallow and quick, the breathing of a living thing that senses danger and is gathering its strength for whatever comes next. And the stars turned overhead in their ancient, indifferent patterns, and the moon rose and cast its silver light across the rooftops and the ramparts and the faces of the men who stood upon them, and the story continued. The way it always continues, the way it must continue, because the story of Orhan Sahib is not a story that can be contained or concluded or brought to a neat and satisfying end. It is a story that lives and breathes and grows, a story that is written not in ink but in blood and in sweat and in the tears of the people who inhabit it, a story that is told not by one voice but by a chorus of voices, each one adding its own note to the great, swelling, magnificent, terrible symphony that is the human experience. And the symphony does not end, it never ends, it simply pauses between movements, gathering its breath, reviewing its themes, preparing for the next passage. Next phrase, the next sustained, soaring, heartbreaking, glorious note that will fill the silence and shake the walls and remind everyone who hears it that they are alive, that they are part of something larger than themselves, that their choices matter and their courage is not in vain, and that the dawn, when it comes, will find them still standing, still fighting, still hopping, still believing, because that is what it means to be human, and that is what it means to follow Orhan Sahib into the darkness and out the other side.